Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that would make the worst reality TV show look like a peaceful meditation retreat, the Mongol conquests. We're diving into what it was really like to live through the most terrifying, efficient, and surprisingly organized apocalypse in human history. Forget everything you think you know about medieval warfare. This wasn't knights in shining armor or noble sieges with banners fluttering prettily in the wind. This was pure, calculated terror on horseback, moving faster than news could travel and hitting harder than a sledgehammer to the face of civilization itself. This was the end of the world, delivered with military precision and an attention to detail that would make a Swiss clockmaker weep with envy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in a prosperous city in the 13th century. Maybe it's Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, home to nearly 2 million people and the greatest library on earth. Maybe it's Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, where golden domes catch the morning sun and merchants from Constantinople trade in silk and spices. Or perhaps it's one of the great Chinese metropolises that had stood for over 1,000 years, where pagodas rise like prayers to heaven and the streets hum with the organized chaos of civilization. Your life is comfortable, predictable. You wake up to the sound of merchants hawking their wares, children playing in narrow cobblestone streets, and the gentle hum of a world that has found its rhythm after centuries of development. The city walls are thick, the gates are strong, and your grandfather's grandfather lived and died in the same house where you sleep each night. This is the way things have always been. This is the way things will always be. Then one morning, everything changes. A dust cloud appears on the horizon. At first, it's just a smudge against the sky, easy to dismiss as a caravan returning from distant lands or perhaps a merchant train bringing exotic goods from the steppes. But it grows and grows. Hour by hour, that innocent smudge transforms into something that makes your blood run cold, and then you realize what you're looking at isn't dust at all. It's an army unlike anything your grandfather's grandfathers ever faced. Unlike anything in your worst nightmares. Unlike anything that should exist in this world. These aren't the soldiers you know. No banners fluttering majestically in the wind, no gleaming armor catching the sunlight like something from a courtly romance. No singing, no trumpets, no colorful pennants announcing noble houses and ancient lineages. Just wave after wave of horsemen, moving like a living shadow across the landscape, silent, except for the thunder of hooves that seems to shake the very earth beneath your feet. They ride with an efficiency that feels almost supernatural, their horses' hooves drumming a rhythm that sounds like the heartbeat of death itself. This is your introduction to the Mongol war machine, and if you're very, very lucky, you might live long enough to tell someone about it. But let's be honest here, the chances weren't good. The chances were never good when the Mongols came calling. Chapter 1. The Storm from the Steppe. To understand what life was like during the Mongol conquests, you first need to understand what made these conquests so uniquely terrifying. This wasn't your typical medieval war where armies faced off in neat little battles, exchanged a few sword blows, captured a castle or two, and everyone went home for dinner afterward. This wasn't about settling a border dispute or determining whose prince had the better claim to a throne. The Mongols didn't just conquer territory, they conquered time itself. Speed was their weapon, and surprise was their strategy. A Mongol army could cover 180 miles in 3 days when the terrain was favorable. Let that sink in for a moment. In an age where most armies moved at a walking pace, struggling to cover 20 miles on a good day with their heavy armor and supply wagons, the Mongols moved like lightning made flesh. They could be 1,000 miles away one week and knocking on your city gates the next, having traveled through terrain that maps insisted was impassable. They achieved this supernatural speed through a combination of factors that would make modern military strategists weep with envy. First, every Mongol warrior had multiple horses. Not one faithful steed like some romantic knight, not two for redundancy, but usually 3 to 5 horses per rider. When one horse tired, they'd switch to another without stopping, without even slowing down. They could literally ride fresh horses in relay while their enemies were still trying to saddle up their single mount. Second, they traveled impossibly light. Forget baggage trains loaded with supplies, siege equipment, and all the paraphernalia of civilized warfare. Mongol warriors carried everything they needed on their person or could find along the way. They drank mare's milk, fermented into a mildly alcoholic beverage that provided nutrition and hydration. They ate dried meat that could last for weeks without spoiling. And when times got really tough, they'd open a vein in their horse's neck and drink the blood. Nutritious, portable, and absolutely horrifying to their enemies who couldn't imagine such barbarism. But here's what made them truly terrifying: their information network. The Mongols had developed the most sophisticated intelligence system the world had ever seen. They knew about your city before you knew about them. They knew your defenses, your leadership, your internal politics, your economic weaknesses, your military capabilities, your food supplies, your water sources, and most importantly, they knew your psychological breaking points. They employed merchants, travelers, and diplomats as spies. Not just casual informants, but trained intelligence operatives who could spend months or years in a target area, learning languages, making contacts, mapping defenses, and identifying potential collaborators. They captured prisoners and interrogated them systematically, using techniques that combined psychological manipulation with physical coercion. They even used a kind of medieval psychological warfare, deliberately spreading stories about their own brutality to soften up targets before they arrived. These stories weren't random rumors, they were carefully crafted propaganda designed to break the will to resist. A merchant might arrive in your city 6 months before the Mongols, telling tales of distant cities that had been completely destroyed, of populations slaughtered to the last child, of rivers running red with blood. By the time these stories had circulated and been embellished by local storytellers, people were already terrified of an enemy they had never seen. By the time you saw that dust cloud on the horizon, the Mongols had already been studying you for months, maybe years. They knew exactly where to hit, when to hit, and how to hit for maximum damage. They knew which of your leaders could be bribed, which could be intimidated, and which would have to be eliminated. They knew which parts of your walls were weakest, which gates were most vulnerable, and which water sources could be cut off or poisoned. And then there was their organization. The Mongol army wasn't a disorganized horde of barbarians, despite what Hollywood might have you believe. It was the most disciplined, well-organized military force of its time, possibly of any time before the Industrial Age. They fought in units of 10, called an arban, commanded by a single leader who was responsible for the behavior and performance of every man under his command. 10 arbans made a jagun of 100 men. 10 jaguns made a mingan of 1,000, and 10 mingans made a tumen of 10,000 warriors. Each unit had specific roles, specific signals, and specific objectives. They could execute complex maneuvers that would make a Roman legion proud, coordinating the movements of tens of thousands of horsemen across miles of battlefield, with precision that seemed almost magical to their enemies. A favorite tactic was the feigned retreat, where they'd pretend to flee in panic, draw enemy forces into a pursuit across unfavorable terrain, then wheel around and crush their disorganized opponents with a perfectly timed counterattack. They perfected this maneuver so well that many enemies learned to be suspicious when the Mongols appeared to be losing. But suspicion wasn't enough when you were facing warriors who could make their apparent defeats look so convincing that even experienced military leaders were fooled. Their siege warfare was equally sophisticated. When they encountered a fortified city, they didn't just sit around and wait for starvation to do the work, like so many medieval armies. They brought in Chinese engineers who had been perfecting siege warfare for centuries, Muslim mathematicians who could calculate trajectories and structural stress points, and European craftsmen who understood the weaknesses of Western fortification designs. They had catapults that could hurl boulders the size of cows with devastating accuracy. They had trebuchets that could launch projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over impossible distances. They had siege engines that could punch through walls like they were made of paper. And if that wasn't enough, they'd dam rivers to flood cities, redirect water sources to leave defenders dying of thirst, or simply build their own fortifications around a city and wait for hunger and disease to do their work. But perhaps their most effective weapon was terror itself. The Mongols understood that reputation was more powerful than any sword, more devastating than any siege engine, more effective than any military strategy. If a city surrendered immediately when they arrived, the inhabitants might be treated relatively well. The Mongols needed administrators, craftsmen, and merchants to run their growing empire. They had no interest in ruling over empty wastelands. But if a city resisted, if it forced the Mongols to expend time, effort, and resources in a siege, well, that's when things got very, very ugly. The Mongols practiced what we might call strategic genocide. They would completely annihilate resistant cities, killing every man, woman, and child they could find. Not in the heat of battle, not in a moment of rage, but systematically, methodically, with the same precision they applied to everything else. Then they'd make sure word of this destruction spread to the next city on their route. This wasn't random violence born of bloodlust or cultural savagery. It was calculated terror designed to break the will to resist before the fighting even began, and it worked. City after city would open their gates and surrender without a fight rather than face the alternative. The Mongols could conquer vast territories without losing a single warrior, simply because their reputation preceded them like a plague of fear. But here's the thing that really made the Mongol conquests unique. They were astonishingly successful. In the span of just over 150 years, from the rise of Genghis Khan in the early 13th century to the death of Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia and the edges of the Indian subcontinent. It was an empire larger than the Roman Empire at its height, larger than the British Empire with all its scattered colonies, larger than any empire before or since. They conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome did in 400. They subjugated more peoples, absorbed more cultures, and controlled more resources than any previous conquerors had even dreamed possible. And for the people living through this conquest, it felt like the end of the world, because in many ways it was. Chapter 2. Life in the Crosshairs. So what was it actually like to be an ordinary person living through the Mongol conquests? Let's start with the most basic question. How did you even know they were coming? In most cases, you didn't, and that was the most terrifying part of all. Remember, this was an age before newspapers, before radio, before any kind of mass communication. News traveled at the speed of a horse, and the Mongols moved faster than news. Often, the first sign that the Mongols were in your area wasn't a messenger bearing warnings or a scout reporting enemy movements. It was smoke on the horizon from the last city they'd destroyed. It was refugees streaming past your walls, with wild stories of destruction that seemed too horrible to believe. It was the sudden silence from neighboring settlements that should have been sending their usual merchants and messengers. If you were living in a rural area, you might wake up one morning to find your livestock missing, all of them, the horses, the cattle, the sheep, gone without a trace. Then you'd notice the strange tracks in the mud, hoof prints of horses shod differently than any you'd seen before, arranged in patterns that spoke of military discipline rather than casual travel. You might find arrows with unfamiliar fletching stuck in your fence posts, not shot in anger but left as warnings, as calling cards from an enemy you had never seen. Then your neighbor would fail to come to market, then the next neighbor, and the next. The roads that had always carried a steady stream of travelers would become empty and silent. The weekly mail that connected your village to the wider world would simply stop arriving, and slowly, with growing horror, you would realize that you were being surrounded by an expanding zone of silence and death. By the time you understood what was happening, it was usually too late to run. For city dwellers, the experience was different, but no less terrifying. Cities had walls, gates, guards, systems of warning and defense. They felt safer, more protected from the chaos of the outside world. But the Mongols had been perfecting siege warfare for decades by the time they reached most settled areas, learning from Chinese engineers, Arab mathematicians, and European military architects. They knew every weakness of every type of fortification. Let's say you're living in a typical medieval city when the Mongols arrive. You wake up to the sound of horns blowing, guards shouting from the watchtowers, people running through the streets in panic. From your window, you can see riders on the horizon, but they're keeping their distance just out of arrow range. They're not attacking. Not yet. They're just watching. This is the psychological phase of Mongol warfare, and it's perhaps the most cruel part of all. They would surround a city but not attack immediately. Instead, they'd set up camp just beyond the range of the defenders' weapons and wait. They'd light campfires at night, so you could see exactly how many of them there were. Thousands upon thousands of flickering lights stretching to the horizon like stars fallen to earth. They'd ride back and forth during the day, showing off their horsemanship, their discipline, their numbers, making sure everyone in the city got a good long look at what they were facing. Meanwhile, they'd send in envoys under flags of truce. These weren't crude barbarians shouting threats from horseback. These were sophisticated diplomats, often speaking the local language perfectly, dressed in fine robes, offering reasonable terms in calm, civilized voices. The message was always the same: surrender now, and you'll be incorporated into the Mongol Empire. Your craftsmen will be valued and protected. Your merchants will prosper under imperial trade policies. Your administrators will be given new positions in the expanding imperial bureaucracy. Your religious leaders will be free to practice their faith. Your people will enjoy the protection and prosperity that comes with being part of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Resist, and everyone dies. Everyone. Men, women, children, elderly, sick, healthy, noble, peasant. Everyone. They weren't bluffing. They never bluffed. The psychological pressure of this situation was unbearable. Imagine knowing that your fate hung on a single decision made by your city's leaders, people you might never have met, people whose wisdom and courage you had no way of judging. Imagine looking at your children and knowing that their lives depended on whether the mayor or the bishop or the military commander was feeling brave or pragmatic on that particular day. Some cities tried to buy time, sending their own envoys to negotiate terms, hoping for rescue that never came. The Mongols were usually patient with these negotiations, but their patience had limits. And when those limits were reached, the consequences were swift and final. If a city chose to resist, the Mongols would begin their assault with a bombardment that could last for days or weeks. Their Chinese engineers had developed trebuchets that could hurl 300-pound stones with devastating accuracy. But they didn't just throw rocks. They threw burning pitch that would stick to everything it touched and burn with a heat that water couldn't extinguish. They threw diseased corpses, both human and animal, to spread plague and pestilence within the city walls. They threw captured prisoners back over the walls, sometimes still alive, sometimes not, sometimes mutilated in ways designed to break the defenders' morale. They threw the severed heads of the city's own messengers who had been sent to negotiate, along with written messages describing in graphic detail what would happen to everyone in the city if the resistance continued. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. The constant noise of the bombardment made sleep impossible. The stench of decay and burning flesh made eating difficult. The knowledge that death could arrive at any moment, from any direction, in any form, made rational thought nearly impossible. But let's say your city's leaders were wise enough or frightened enough to surrender before the siege began. You might think the worst was over. You'd be wrong. Surrender didn't mean safety. It meant the beginning of a different kind of ordeal, one that would determine the rest of your life and the lives of your children. The Mongols had a systematic approach to conquest that they applied to every settlement, large or small. It was like a bureaucratic machine designed to process human beings, sorting them into useful categories and disposing of the rest. First came the census. Every person, every animal, every building, every resource was counted and cataloged. This wasn't for taxation purposes, at least not initially. It was for resource allocation. The Mongols needed to know exactly what they had conquered before they could decide what to do with it. You see, the Mongols had a use for everyone, and that use wasn't necessarily what you might hope for. If you were a skilled craftsman, a metalworker, a mason, an engineer, a physician, or a scholar, you were valuable. You'd be marked for relocation. Mongol policy was to concentrate skilled workers in specific areas where they could be most useful to the empire. This meant being separated from your family, your community, everything you'd ever known, and being marched hundreds or thousands of miles to work in a foreign land under foreign masters, using your skills to build weapons and fortifications that would be used to conquer more cities like your own. If you were a merchant with knowledge of trade routes, currency exchange, or foreign languages, you had a chance of prospering under Mongol rule. The Mongols were great believers in trade and commerce. They protected merchants, established standardized currency, and built roads and way stations across their empire. But you'd be trading under Mongol terms, paying Mongol taxes, subject to Mongol law, and always under the watchful eye of Mongol officials who would ensure that your prosperity served imperial interests rather than your own. If you were a farmer or a common laborer, your fate was less certain. You might be allowed to continue your work in your traditional location, but you'd be doing it for new masters, producing food and goods for an empire that stretched across continents. The Mongol Empire ran on tribute, enormous quantities of resources flowing from conquered territories to support the military and administrative apparatus. That tribute had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was you. If you were a soldier or a member of the ruling class, your future was decidedly grim. The Mongols had a policy of eliminating potential sources of resistance. Military leaders, nobles, government officials, and religious leaders who might rally opposition were typically executed as a matter of course. Not out of personal animosity, not in the heat of battle, but as a practical matter of imperial administration. Dead enemies don't rebel. And if you were unlucky enough to be in a city that chose to resist, well, let's talk about what happened to Baghdad. Chapter 3. The Fall of Cities. Baghdad's Apocalypse. Baghdad in 1258 was one of the greatest cities in the world. It was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual and political center of the Islamic world, home to the House of Wisdom, where scholars from every corner of the known world came to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Its population was estimated at between 1 and 2 million people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth, larger than Paris, larger than London, rivaling even the great cities of China. The city was a marvel of urban planning and engineering. Its circular walls enclosed districts devoted to different crafts and trades. Its canals and aqueducts brought fresh water from the Tigris River to every neighborhood. Its libraries contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, preserving the knowledge of antiquity and advancing the frontiers of human understanding. Its markets sold goods from India, China, Africa, and Europe. Its mosques and palaces were architectural wonders that had taken centuries to perfect. Baghdad was, in every sense, a jewel of human civilization. When Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, arrived at the gates of Baghdad with his army in January of 1258, the city's leaders faced an impossible choice. They could surrender and hope for mercy, abandoning their independence and their role as leaders of the Islamic world. Or they could resist and trust in their walls, their defenders, and their faith to protect them. They chose to resist. What followed was one of the most comprehensive destructions of a major city in human history, a catastrophe so complete that Baghdad would never fully recover its former glory. The siege lasted just 13 days. 13 days to bring down a city that had stood for 5 centuries, a city that had weathered invasions, rebellions, and natural disasters, a city that its inhabitants believed was under the special protection of Allah Himself. The Mongols had perfected their siegecraft to an art form that combined engineering brilliance with psychological warfare. They diverted the Tigris River, using the knowledge of captured engineers to build dams and channels that flooded the city's defensive positions while leaving the Mongol camps on higher ground. They built a palisade around the entire city, a wooden wall that prevented anyone from escaping and turned Baghdad into a giant prison. They brought in siege engines from across their empire, catapults and trebuchets operated by Chinese engineers, Islamic mathematicians, and European craftsmen who had been captured in previous campaigns. These engines could punch through Baghdad's walls like they were made of parchment. The bombardment was continuous, day and night, a rain of stone and fire that made movement through the city impossible and turned sleeping into a gamble with death. But the real horror began after the city fell. On February 10, 1258, the Mongols breached Baghdad's walls and poured into the city like a tide of destruction. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was what the Mongols called the cleansing, a systematic process of extermination that they had perfected through decades of conquest. Every person they encountered was killed. Men, women, children, elderly, sick, healthy, rich, poor, learned, ignorant, it didn't matter. The only exceptions were some craftsmen whose skills were deemed useful enough that they were enslaved rather than executed, and a few scholars whose knowledge was considered valuable enough to preserve. But even among these survivors, the selection process was arbitrary and cruel. A master metalworker might be spared while his apprentices were killed. A physician might survive while his patients were slaughtered. A scribe might live while the poets and philosophers around him died. The killing went on for weeks. Contemporary accounts, written by the few survivors and by Mongol historians who recorded the event with bureaucratic precision, describe streets running red with blood, the Tigris River clogged with corpses, and the stench of death hanging over the city like a physical presence. The House of Wisdom, with its irreplaceable collection of manuscripts and scrolls representing centuries of human knowledge, was destroyed with methodical thoroughness. Books were thrown into the river in such quantities that witnesses said you could walk across the Tigris on parchment and paper without getting your feet wet. Mathematical treatises that had taken generations to develop, medical texts that could have saved countless lives, philosophical works that had pushed the boundaries of human thought, all of it was lost forever. The killing wasn't random or chaotic. It was organized, systematic, almost bureaucratic in its efficiency. The Mongols divided the population into groups, assigned each group to a specific unit of soldiers, and then carried out the executions with the same precision they applied to everything else. They kept records, they counted the dead. Each soldier was required to produce a specific number of severed ears as proof that quotas had been met. Some accounts suggest that over 800 people were killed in Baghdad alone, though the exact number will never be known because the record keepers were among the victims. When it was over, Baghdad was a ghost town. A city of 2 million had been reduced to perhaps a few thousand survivors, mostly slaves marked for transportation to other parts of the empire. The great palaces stood empty, their rooms filled with rotting corpses. The markets were silent, their stalls abandoned or destroyed. The canals ran red with blood and debris. And Baghdad wasn't unique. This wasn't an exceptional atrocity born of unusual circumstances or personal hatred. This was standard Mongol policy, applied with identical precision across their empire. The same pattern was repeated in city after city across Asia and Europe. Kiev, which had been one of the largest cities in Europe, with a population of over 100, was so thoroughly destroyed that a visitor 6 years later described it as having only 200 houses left standing. The rest had been burned, torn down, or simply abandoned to decay. Merv, in present-day Turkmenistan, was completely obliterated. This had been one of the great cities of Central Asia, a center of trade and learning, with a population of over 1 million. After the Mongols finished with it, there was nothing left but ruins. The irrigation systems that had sustained the city for centuries were destroyed, the canals filled with rubble and corpses, the surrounding farmland abandoned and left to return to desert. Nishapur, in northeastern Iran, suffered perhaps the most thorough destruction of all. The city had killed a Mongol general during a siege, and in response, the Mongols not only slaughtered every living thing in the city, but actually dismantled it stone by stone. They destroyed every building, filled in every well, killed every animal, and salted the earth so that nothing would grow there again. The site remained uninhabited for generations. But here's what made these destructions so psychologically devastating. They were methodical rather than emotional. The Mongols didn't kill in the heat of battle or in a frenzy of bloodlust. They killed systematically, efficiently, almost bureaucratically. They would divide the population into groups based on age, gender, and skills. They would process each group according to predetermined criteria. They would execute their victims in organized fashion, keeping careful records of the numbers killed. It was genocide as administrative procedure, mass murder as a matter of imperial policy, and that made it infinitely more terrifying than simple brutality or random violence. Now you might wonder, if the Mongols were so thorough in their destructions, how do we know what happened? How did anyone survive to tell the tale? The answer reveals another layer of Mongol psychological warfare. They deliberately left some survivors. Not many, but enough to spread the word. These survivors were often the most traumatized, the ones who had witnessed the worst of the destruction, seen their families murdered, watched their cities burn. They would flee to other cities and towns, carrying stories of unimaginable horror that grew more terrifying with each retelling. These stories served the Mongol purpose perfectly. Each tale of destruction made the next city more likely to surrender without a fight. The Mongols understood that terror was a weapon that could be used again and again, each time more effectively than the last, until the mere mention of their name was enough to open city gates and bring rulers to their knees. But not every city chose to resist. Some submitted immediately when the Mongols arrived, throwing open their gates and offering tribute and allegiance. So what was life like in these places? Surprisingly, it could be quite good, better, in many cases, than life had been under the previous rulers. Chapter 4. The surprising benefits of Mongol rule. The Mongols were pragmatists above all else. And they understood that ruling a vast empire required more than just fear and violence. They needed their territories to be productive, their subjects to be loyal, and their administrative systems to be efficient. This meant that cities and regions that submitted willingly were often treated not just mercifully, but generously. Take the city of Samarkand, for example. When the Mongols arrived in 1220, the city's leaders immediately surrendered. Rather than being punished for their previous allegiance to the Khwarezmid Empire, Samarkand was transformed into one of the most prosperous cities in the Mongol Empire. Its position on the Silk Road made it a natural center for trade, and the Mongols invested heavily in its infrastructure, building new markets, improving its defenses, and establishing it as a major administrative center. The Mongols were also remarkably tolerant of religious differences, not out of philosophical enlightenment, but as a matter of practical policy. They ruled over dozens of different cultures, languages, and religions. Trying to impose religious uniformity would have been impossible and counterproductive. Instead, they created a kind of multicultural empire held together by military force and economic incentives rather than shared identity or belief. As long as you didn't challenge their political authority, you could worship whatever gods you chose, follow whatever customs didn't interfere with imperial administration, and maintain whatever cultural traditions were compatible with Mongol law. In fact, the Mongol court often patronized multiple religions simultaneously, hedging their bets with various deities and earning the loyalty of different religious communities. Mongol rulers would attend Buddhist ceremonies, Islamic festivals, Christian services, and traditional shamanic rituals with equal enthusiasm. This created a religious marketplace where different faiths competed for imperial favor rather than facing persecution or suppression. This tolerance extended to intellectual and artistic pursuits as well. The Mongols were great collectors of knowledge and talent, gathering scholars, artists, engineers, and craftsmen from across their empire, and bringing them together in centers of learning and production that became the most cosmopolitan institutions the world had ever seen. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad might have been destroyed, but the Mongols established new centers of learning in Karakoram, Beijing, and other cities where scholars from China could work alongside mathematicians from Persia, astronomers from Arabia, and philosophers from Europe. These institutions produced innovations in science, technology, and art that combined insights from multiple traditions in ways that would have been impossible under more isolated political systems. But even in cities that prospered under Mongol rule, life was fundamentally different from what had come before. The changes went far beyond simply having new rulers or paying taxes to different officials. Living under Mongol rule meant living under a system unlike anything the settled world had ever experienced. The Mongols brought with them not just new masters, but an entirely new way of organizing society, one that prioritized efficiency, mobility, and imperial unity over local traditions and community autonomy. First and most importantly, you were no longer primarily a member of your city, your tribe, or your nation. You were a subject of the Great Khan, and that identity superseded all others. This might sound like a mere political abstraction, but it had profound practical implications for daily life. Under traditional medieval systems, your identity was largely determined by where you were born and who your parents were. A peasant in France was French first and foremost, bound by French laws, following French customs, speaking French dialect. A merchant in Baghdad was Arab or Persian, shaped by Islamic law and Middle Eastern traditions. A craftsman in Kiev was Rus, part of the Orthodox Christian world with its own distinctive culture and values. The Mongols swept all of that away with characteristic thoroughness. Under their system, what mattered wasn't where you came from or who your ancestors were, but what you could do for the empire. A Chinese engineer could find himself working in Persia, designing irrigation systems for desert cities. A Persian administrator might be posted to Russia, organizing tribute collection from Slavic peasants. A European craftsman could end up in Mongolia itself, creating luxury goods for the Great Khan's court. This created a kind of meritocratic internationalism that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. If you had useful skills and demonstrated loyalty to the empire, you could rise in Mongol society regardless of your ethnic background, your religious beliefs, or your place of birth. Some of the highest-ranking officials in the Mongol Empire were Chinese, Arabs, Persians, or Europeans who had proven their worth to their Mongol masters. But this mobility came at an enormous cost. Traditional community structures were deliberately broken up. Extended families were separated, often permanently. Local power structures were dismantled and replaced with imperial appointees. Ancient customs were abandoned or modified to fit Mongol preferences and administrative requirements. The Mongols understood that people with strong local ties were more likely to rebel against imperial authority, so they made sure those ties were severed, often with surgical precision. Let's say you were a skilled metal worker living in a city that had surrendered to the Mongols. You might find yourself selected for relocation to a new city hundreds of miles away, where your skills were needed for a specific imperial project. You'd be given a new house, new neighbors, new local officials to report to, new customs to follow, new languages to learn. Your old life would simply cease to exist. The community you'd grown up in, the traditions you'd inherited from your parents, the local dialects and customs that had shaped your identity, the religious practices that had given your life meaning, all of that would be left behind forever. This wasn't necessarily a tragedy. Your new life might be more prosperous than your old one. The Mongols paid well for skilled work, and they provided resources and protection that might not have been available under your previous rulers. You might find yourself working on projects of unprecedented scope and ambition, collaborating with craftsmen from distant lands, learning techniques and technologies that would have been impossible to access in your traditional community. But it was a complete break with the past. The social networks that had supported you, the cultural frameworks that had given your life structure and meaning, the local knowledge that had made you an expert in your own environment, all of that would have to be rebuilt from scratch in an alien setting. In its place, you'd become part of something larger and more cosmopolitan, but also more impersonal and bureaucratic. Instead of being a master craftsman known and respected in your hometown, you'd become an imperial employee, identified by your skills and your loyalty rather than your family name or local reputation. Chapter 5. The Mongol Administrative Machine. The Mongol administrative system was sophisticated but alien to most of their subjects. It was based on decimal organization, with officials responsible for units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 households. These officials were appointed by the Mongol hierarchy based on merit and loyalty, not elected by local communities or inherited through traditional bloodlines. This system was revolutionary in its efficiency and standardization, but it was also impersonal in a way that many people found deeply disturbing. Under traditional systems, local leaders were often people you knew personally, members of prominent local families, individuals whose backgrounds and character were familiar to the community. They might be corrupt or incompetent, but they were your corrupt and incompetent officials, people who shared your culture and understood your local concerns. Under the Mongol system, your local administrator might be a Chinese bureaucrat who spoke no local language, a Persian scholar who had never seen your type of agriculture before, or a Mongol warrior who viewed civilian administration as a temporary assignment between military campaigns. These officials might be perfectly competent and even benevolent, but they were fundamentally alien to your world. Laws were standardized across the empire according to the Yasa, the great legal code supposedly established by Genghis Khan himself. This meant that traditional legal systems, whether based on religious law, tribal custom, or royal decree, were either abolished entirely or subordinated to Mongol imperial law. The Yasa was actually quite progressive in many ways. It protected religious freedom, prohibited the persecution of clerics, established principles of meritocracy that were centuries ahead of their time, and created legal protections for merchants and travelers that facilitated trade across vast distances. But it was also harsh and unforgiving, with death penalties for crimes that traditional legal systems might have punished with fines or imprisonment. Theft was punishable by death. Adultery was punishable by death. Desertion from military service was punishable by death. Lying to a superior was punishable by death. And crucially, any challenge to Mongol authority, no matter how small or symbolic, was punishable by death. This created a legal environment that was simultaneously more just and more terrifying than what most people had known before. A poor man accused of theft might receive a fairer hearing under Mongol law than he would have under a traditional system dominated by local nobles. But if he were found guilty, there would be no possibility of redemption, no chance to make restitution, no appeal to local customs or family connections. Justice was swift, impartial, and final. The Mongols also revolutionized trade and communication across their empire through the establishment of the yam, a postal relay system that allowed messages and goods to travel from one end of the empire to the other faster than had ever been possible before. Way stations were built every 25 to 30 miles along major routes, stocked with fresh horses, food, and supplies. Mongol messengers could cover vast distances in days rather than weeks or months, changing horses at each station and riding almost continuously. This system was so efficient that it wouldn't be surpassed until the invention of the telegraph 6 centuries later. For merchants, this created unprecedented opportunities. The Mongols protected trade routes with military patrols, standardized weights and measures across their empire, established a common currency that was accepted from Europe to Asia, and created a passport system that guaranteed safe passage to authorized travelers. A merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing with a Mongol passport and be guaranteed fair treatment, protection from bandits, and access to supplies and accommodation along the way. The economic benefits of this system were enormous. Trade flourished on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the age of exploration. Goods that had once been rare luxuries became common commodities. Technologies and ideas spread rapidly across continents. The prosperity generated by this trade helped fund the empire's military machine and administrative apparatus. But for ordinary people, the yam system meant something else entirely. You were always being watched. The same network that carried commercial goods and administrative messages also carried intelligence. The Mongols always knew what was happening in every corner of their empire. Local rebellions, natural disasters, economic problems, religious movements, political disputes, even family feuds. All of this information flowed back to the central authorities with remarkable speed and accuracy. Privacy, as we might understand it, simply didn't exist under Mongol rule. Your neighbors might be Mongol informants, reporting on your activities and conversations. The merchants passing through your town might be intelligence agents, gathering information about local conditions and potential threats. The official who collected your taxes definitely reported on your behavior, your attitude, your level of loyalty to the empire. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance that was both protective and oppressive. Crime was rare because punishment was swift and certain. Bandits couldn't operate when every village had officials who reported directly to military commanders. Corrupt local officials couldn't steal too much because their activities were monitored by imperial auditors. But any form of dissent or independent political activity was also impossible. You couldn't complain about imperial policies without word reaching the authorities. You couldn't organize resistance without being detected. You couldn't even express nostalgia for the old days without risking accusations of disloyalty. The empire's information network was like a vast web that touched every community, every household, every individual life. This surveillance system was particularly effective because it combined traditional methods with Mongol innovations. The Mongols used local informants, but they also rotated administrators regularly to prevent them from developing local loyalties. They encouraged trade and travel, but they also monitored everyone who moved between communities. They tolerated local customs, but they also required regular reports on any activities that might pose a threat to imperial stability. The result was a system of control that was more comprehensive and more subtle than anything that had existed before. Unlike traditional despotisms that relied primarily on fear and force, the Mongol system created incentives for cooperation and compliance. It was often easier and more profitable to work with the system than against it. But the psychological cost of this cooperation was enormous. People learned to watch their words, to monitor their own behavior, to think twice before expressing any opinion that might be construed as criticism of the empire. The spontaneous conversations, the casual complaints, the informal political discussions that had been part of traditional community life all but disappeared under Mongol rule. Chapter 6. The Mongol War Machine, Life in Motion. To truly understand what life was like during the Mongol conquests, you need to understand the nature of the force that was reshaping the world. The Mongol military wasn't just an army in the conventional sense. It was a civilization on horseback, a nomadic empire that could mobilize its entire society for war at a moment's notice. Every Mongol was a soldier, not metaphorically, but literally. Men, women, and children all had roles in the military structure. Boys learned to ride and shoot before they could properly walk straight. Girls were trained in camp management, logistics, and the countless support activities that kept an army functioning in the field. Elderly people served as advisors, keepers of military tradition, and guardians of the cultural knowledge that held Mongol society together. This meant that when the Mongols went to war, they weren't just deploying their army. They were deploying their entire society, their whole way of life, their complete cultural and economic system. War wasn't something they did, it was something they were. A typical Mongol army on campaign was actually a moving city, a mobile nation that could sustain itself indefinitely in the field. For every warrior, there might be 3 or 4 non-combatants, herders to manage the vast horse herds that provided both transportation and food, craftsmen to maintain weapons and equipment, engineers to build siege weapons and fortifications, administrators to organize supplies and coordinate logistics, and families to provide the social structure that held everything together. This created a military force unlike anything the settled world had ever encountered. Most medieval armies were composed of soldiers who were temporarily away from their normal lives. They had farms to return to, shops to run, families waiting for them at home. They wanted to fight their battles, achieve their objectives, and go home to resume their regular activities. The Mongols had no home to return to. The army was their home. The campaign was their normal life. War was their natural state of existence. This gave them an enormous psychological and strategic advantage. They could sustain campaigns for years without their morale breaking down or their effectiveness declining. They could operate thousands of miles from their starting point without losing cohesion or purpose. They could adapt to any terrain, any climate, any strategic situation, because their entire society was built around the principle of mobility and adaptation. But it also meant that for the people they conquered, there was no safe season, no time when they could expect to be left alone to rebuild or recover. Traditional medieval warfare followed agricultural rhythms. Armies would campaign during the summer months when the weather was good and the roads were passable. In winter, everyone would go home to tend their farms, repair their equipment, and wait for spring to come around again. There were natural breaks in the cycle of conflict. periods when communities could focus on peaceful activities and normal life could resume. The Mongols campaigned year-round. They were equally comfortable fighting in the blazing heat of the Central Asian summer or the brutal cold of the Russian winter. Their lifestyle had prepared them for extremes of weather that would incapacitate traditional armies. Their mobility allowed them to move between different climate zones as conditions required. Their herds provided fresh food regardless of local agricultural cycles. This meant that if you were living in an area under Mongol pressure, you never knew when the next attack might come. You couldn't plan your harvests, your trade expeditions, or your building projects with any confidence that they wouldn't be interrupted by warfare. You couldn't relax your defenses during winter months or focus on peaceful activities during traditional off-seasons. The psychological stress of this constant uncertainty was enormous. Traditional societies had rhythms, cycles, predictable patterns of peace and conflict that allowed people to organize their lives and plan for the future. The Mongols shattered all of that, creating a world where the only constant was change and the only certainty was uncertainty. Their tactical innovations were equally disruptive to traditional ways of thinking about warfare. The Mongols had perfected the art of mobile warfare to a degree that wouldn't be matched until the invention of mechanized warfare in the 20th century. They fought primarily as horse archers, using powerful composite bows that could accurately hit targets at ranges of up to 350 yards. These bows were marvels of engineering, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew that could store and release enormous amounts of energy. A Mongol warrior could shoot while riding at full gallop, maintaining accuracy that would have been impressive for a stationary archer using a crossbow or longbow. But their real innovation was in their use of speed and coordination. A Mongol army could split into multiple columns, travel along separate routes for hundreds of miles, and reconverge at a predetermined location with timing precise enough to coordinate complex attacks involving tens of thousands of warriors spread across vast distances. They could execute strategic deceptions that covered hundreds of miles and involved multiple armies operating independently but in coordination. They could appear to be retreating in one direction while actually maneuvering to attack from a completely different angle. They could make their enemies think they were facing a small raiding party when they were actually confronting the advance guard of a major invasion force. Their intelligence network was so sophisticated that they often knew more about enemy movements than the enemy commanders did themselves. They used merchants, diplomats, and captured prisoners as sources of information. They employed scouts who could travel vast distances undetected, gathering intelligence about terrain, weather, local politics, and military preparations. For the people living through Mongol campaigns, this created a sense of facing an almost supernatural enemy. How else could you explain an army that seemed to be everywhere at once, that could appear from unexpected directions, that always seemed to know exactly where to strike for maximum effect, that could coordinate attacks across impossible distances with perfect timing? Stories spread of Mongol shamans who could control the weather, calling up storms to cover their movements or clearing skies to improve visibility for their archers. Tales circulated of Mongol horses that could run faster than the wind, never tiring, never needing rest or food. Legends grew of Mongol arrows that never missed their mark, guided by spirits to find their targets regardless of distance or obstacles. These stories were obviously exaggerated, but they were believed because the reality of Mongol military efficiency was so far beyond what people thought possible that supernatural explanations seemed more plausible than natural ones. The Mongols encouraged these supernatural explanations. They understood that fear was their most effective weapon, and fear of the unknown was more powerful than fear of the merely human. They deliberately cultivated an aura of mystery and otherworldliness, using psychological warfare techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. They also employed conventional psychological warfare, on a scale that was unprecedented. When approaching a target, they would often send advance parties to devastate the surrounding countryside, not for strategic reasons, but simply to create refugees. These refugees would flee to the nearest fortified city, bringing with them stories of Mongol atrocities and straining the city's resources with additional mouths to feed and bodies to shelter. By the time the main Mongol force arrived, the city would already be demoralized, overcrowded, and running short of supplies. The Mongols would then offer terms: surrender now, and you'll be treated mercifully like the cities that have already submitted. Resist, and you'll share the fate of the villages we've already destroyed, the ruins you can see smoking on the horizon, the refugees who are telling you stories of rape and murder and streets running with blood. It was an offer that was very difficult to refuse, especially when you were looking at an enemy force that seemed to have materialized out of thin air and could disappear just as quickly if you tried to pursue them. Chapter 7: Survival Strategies: The Art of Staying Alive. So, how did ordinary people survive the Mongol conquests? What strategies worked, and what strategies led to disaster? What could you do to improve your chances of living through the greatest military catastrophe in human history? The first and most important lesson was this: you had to pick a side, and you had to pick it early. Neutrality was not an option in the Mongol world. You were either with them or against them, and being against them meant death, but being with them meant adapting to a completely new way of life, abandoning old loyalties, and embracing an uncertain future. The most successful survival strategy was to make yourself useful to the Mongols before they even asked. If you were a craftsman, you made sure your skills were known and valued by the advancing forces. If you were a merchant, you offered your services for trade and transportation, demonstrating your knowledge of local markets and trade routes. If you were an administrator, you showed your understanding of local conditions and your ability to organize resources efficiently. The key was to demonstrate that you could contribute to Mongol objectives rather than simply being a burden or a potential threat. This often meant betraying your traditional loyalties in ways that were psychologically devastating but physically necessary. Local nobles who collaborated with the Mongols early and enthusiastically might be rewarded with greater power and wealth than they had ever enjoyed under the previous system. But they would also be despised by their former subjects as traitors and collaborators, living in constant fear of assassination or rebellion. Merchants who facilitated Mongol trade and administration might prosper beyond their wildest dreams, gaining access to markets and opportunities that had never existed before. But they would be forever marked as profiteers who had benefited from their neighbors' suffering. Craftsmen who worked for the Mongol war machine might find themselves creating weapons and siege engines that would be used to destroy cities like their own. The moral burden of this collaboration was enormous, but the alternative was often death for themselves and their families. The moral calculus was brutal but simple. Collaboration might save your life and the lives of your loved ones. Resistance would almost certainly lead to death for everyone. Individual conscience had to be weighed against collective survival, and most people chose survival. Many people chose collaboration, and some of them prospered under Mongol rule. But the psychological cost was enormous. Traditional codes of honor, loyalty, and community solidarity all had to be abandoned in favor of a new kind of pragmatic individualism that prioritized survival over principle. For those who couldn't or wouldn't collaborate, the alternatives were extremely limited and usually fatal. Flight was possible, but difficult. The Mongols controlled vast territories and had excellent intelligence networks that made it nearly impossible to move without being detected. Refugees could hide temporarily in remote areas, deep forests, mountain fastnesses, island communities, but these areas could only support small populations, and life there was harsh and precarious. Some people fled to regions that were too difficult for the Mongols to control effectively. Dense forests where cavalry was useless, mountain ranges where the terrain favored defenders, swampy areas where horses couldn't operate, desert regions where water sources were scarce and easily defended. But even these refuges were only temporary. The Mongols were remarkably persistent, and they were willing to invest considerable resources in tracking down and eliminating resistance groups that might serve as rallying points for future rebellions. Active resistance was another option, but it had to be very carefully managed to have any chance of success. The Mongols were vulnerable to guerrilla warfare, especially in terrain that was unsuitable for cavalry operations. Small bands of fighters who knew the local geography well could sometimes harass Mongol forces effectively, ambushing supply convoys, assassinating isolated officials, disrupting communications. But such resistance had to be carried out with the understanding that failure meant not just the death of the fighters themselves, but brutal reprisals against the entire local population. The Mongols had a policy of collective responsibility that made resistance extremely costly for entire communities. If one person in a community supported resistance, the entire community could be punished. This meant that resistance fighters often found themselves isolated from their own people, who feared association with them more than they feared Mongol rule. Families would disown resistance fighters. Communities would refuse to provide them with food, shelter, or information. Former friends would turn them in to the authorities for rewards or simply to avoid suspicion. This isolation made sustained resistance nearly impossible. Without local support, resistance groups couldn't operate for extended periods. They couldn't recruit new members, gather intelligence, or coordinate their activities effectively. Most resistance movements were quickly detected and crushed by Mongol forces that were specifically trained in counterinsurgency operations. Perhaps the most effective survival strategy was cultural adaptation. People who could learn Mongol customs, Mongol language, and Mongol values had the best chance of thriving under the new system. This didn't necessarily mean abandoning their original culture entirely, but it did mean learning to navigate between different cultural worlds. The Mongols appreciated people who could serve as intermediaries between the Mongol ruling class and local populations. Interpreters, cultural advisors, and administrators who understood both Mongol and local perspectives were highly valued and well rewarded. These individuals often became the backbone of Mongol administration in conquered territories. But this adaptation came with its own costs. Children who grew up under Mongol rule often found themselves caught between cultures, fully accepted by neither their parents' generation nor by their Mongol contemporaries. They might speak multiple languages but feel truly at home in none of them. They might understand different cultural traditions but feel genuine loyalty to none of them. Traditional family structures were disrupted when family members were relocated to different parts of the empire for administrative or economic reasons. Arranged marriages might now involve partners from completely different cultural backgrounds who had no shared traditions or common language. Religious practices had to be modified to conform to Mongol legal requirements, while still maintaining some connection to ancestral traditions. The result was a generation of people who were culturally cosmopolitan but also culturally rootless, comfortable in many different environments but never fully at home in any of them. They were living bridges between different worlds, but they were also permanent exiles from all of them. Chapter 8: Daily Life Under the New Order. Once the initial conquest was complete and a new Mongol administration was established, what was daily life actually like for ordinary people? What did it mean to wake up each morning in a world that had been fundamentally transformed by conquest? The answer varied enormously depending on your location, your skills, your willingness to adapt to the new system, and sheer luck. But there were some common patterns that emerged across the Mongol Empire. Experiences that were shared by millions of people who found themselves living under the authority of rulers they had never chosen. First, life was more regulated than it had been under most traditional systems. The Mongols were great believers in organization and systematic administration. Everything was counted, catalogued, and controlled. Nothing was left to chance or local custom if it could be standardized and optimized instead. Your household was registered with the local authorities. The number of people in your family, their ages, their occupations, their skills, their health status, their potential military value, all of this information was recorded in official registers that were updated regularly and reported to higher authorities. You couldn't simply pack up and move to a different location without official permission. You couldn't change occupations without approval. You couldn't even travel to the next town without proper documentation. This level of bureaucratic control was unfamiliar and often oppressive to people who had been accustomed to more informal, traditional ways of organizing community life. Under the old system, you might have been poor, but you were also relatively free to make your own decisions about where to live, what work to do, and how to organize your family life. Under the Mongol system, your personal choices were subordinated to imperial needs. If the empire needed metal workers in a distant province, and you happened to be a metal worker, you might find yourself relocated regardless of your personal preferences. If the empire needed soldiers for a new campaign, and you were the right age and health status, you might be conscripted regardless of your family obligations. But this regulation also brought certain benefits that many people grudgingly came to appreciate. Crime was rare because law enforcement was swift and effective. The Mongol legal system might be harsh, but it was also consistent and predictable. You knew exactly what was forbidden and what the consequences would be if you broke the rules. Corruption was less common because officials were held accountable to higher authorities who had no local connections or personal interests in covering up malfeasance. Traditional systems often tolerated a certain amount of corruption as the price of maintaining local autonomy. The Mongol system eliminated corruption by eliminating autonomy. Public works projects were completed efficiently because resources could be mobilized systematically, and resistance to imperial directives was simply not tolerated. Roads were built and maintained. Bridges were constructed where they were needed. Irrigation systems were expanded and improved. Public buildings were erected according to standardized designs that reflected imperial priorities rather than local preferences. The Mongol tax system was generally more efficient than what had existed before, though not necessarily lighter in its burden on ordinary people. Taxes were collected in a standardized manner across the empire, and tax farming was regulated to prevent the worst abuses that had characterized traditional systems. Under the old system, tax collection was often arbitrary and unpredictable. Local officials might demand extra payments for special occasions, personal emergencies, or simply because they felt like it. The amount you owed might depend on your relationship with the tax collector, your family's political connections, or random factors like the weather on the day your assessment was made. Under the Mongol system, you knew exactly what taxes you would owe and when they would be collected. The assessment methods were standardized, the collection procedures were consistent, and appeals processes existed for cases where errors had been made. You didn't have to worry about arbitrary levies or confiscations by local officials who were accountable to no higher authority. For merchants and craftsmen, this created a more predictable business environment. You could plan your production schedules, your inventory levels, and your investment decisions with greater confidence. You knew what your tax obligations would be, what regulations you would have to follow, and what level of imperial protection you could expect for your business activities. This predictability was enormously valuable in a world where economic planning had traditionally been made difficult by political instability and administrative arbitrariness. Many merchants and craftsmen found that they were more prosperous under Mongol rule than they had been under traditional systems, despite the cultural and social costs of imperial domination. Trade flourished under Mongol rule to an extent that would not be seen again until the modern era. The Mongols created the first truly global trading system, connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa through a network of protected routes and standardized procedures that made long-distance commerce safer and more profitable than ever before. A merchant could travel from London to Beijing with a single set of documents and be confident of fair treatment throughout the journey. This created opportunities for wealth creation that had never existed before, but it also meant that local markets were now subject to competition from producers thousands of miles away. But for farmers and agricultural workers, the situation was more mixed. The Mongols understood that agricultural production was the foundation of their empire's wealth, and they generally tried to maintain and improve farming productivity rather than simply extracting resources without regard for long-term sustainability. They introduced new crops from different parts of their empire, spreading agricultural innovations that increased yields and diversified food sources. They improved irrigation systems using engineering knowledge gathered from across their territories. They protected farmers from bandits and raiders who had traditionally preyed on rural communities. However, they also imposed heavy tribute requirements on agricultural communities. A significant portion of each year's harvest had to be delivered to Mongol authorities, either for consumption by the military and administrative apparatus, or for trade with other parts of the empire. This meant that farmers often lived close to subsistence levels. Even in years when harvests were good, there was little surplus available for local investment or improvement. The security and technical support provided by the imperial system came at the cost of economic independence and local prosperity. The Mongol legal system was alien to most of their subjects but generally fair within its own framework. The yasa emphasized practical justice rather than traditional legal procedures or religious law. It was designed to serve imperial needs rather than local customs, but it was applied consistently regardless of social status or ethnic background. Theft, adultery, and violence were punished severely and consistently, but the Mongols were also pragmatic about legal disputes. They were more interested in restoring order and productivity than in enforcing abstract legal principles or maintaining traditional hierarchies. This could work to the advantage of ordinary people who found themselves in conflict with traditional elites. Under the old system, a peasant who had a dispute with a nobleman had little hope of fair treatment. The legal system was designed to maintain existing social hierarchies and protect the interests of established elites. Under Mongol law, the peasant might actually win if the facts were on his side. The Mongol judge would be more interested in determining the truth of the matter than in maintaining traditional social relationships. Justice was blind to social status in ways that traditional systems had never attempted. But Mongol law was also inflexible in ways that traditional systems were not. There was little room for mercy, extenuating circumstances, or local customs that might modify the application of imperial law. Justice was swift and final, with few opportunities for appeal or reconsideration. Religious life under Mongol rule was generally freer than it had been under most traditional systems. The Mongols practiced religious tolerance not out of philosophical conviction, but as a matter of practical policy. They needed the cooperation of religious leaders and institutions to maintain social stability and legitimacy. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and practitioners of traditional folk religions could all worship freely as long as they didn't challenge Mongol political authority. In many cases, religious leaders found their position enhanced under Mongol rule because they were seen as useful intermediaries between the Mongol government and local populations. The Mongols often patronized multiple religions simultaneously, attending Buddhist ceremonies, Islamic festivals, and Christian services with equal enthusiasm. This created a more cosmopolitan religious environment than most people had ever experienced. But it also meant that traditional religious hierarchies and authority structures were subordinated to Mongol political control. Religious leaders who had once been autonomous now served at the pleasure of Mongol officials. Their authority derived not from their standing within their own religious communities, but from their usefulness to the imperial administration. This fundamentally altered the relationship between religious and political authority in ways that would have lasting consequences. Chapter 9. Women and Children in the Mongol World. The Mongol conquest had particularly complex implications for women and children, whose lives were transformed in ways that reflected both the progressive and oppressive aspects of Mongol society. Traditional Mongol culture gave women significantly more power and authority than was common in most settled civilizations. Mongol women could own property, participate in political discussions, and sometimes even lead military campaigns. They were expected to be strong, capable, and independent, able to manage households and make important decisions while their husbands were away on campaign. This created opportunities for women in conquered territories who were willing and able to adapt to Mongol customs. Some women found that they had more freedom and influence under Mongol rule than they had enjoyed under traditional systems that strictly limited women's roles and opportunities. But the conquest process itself was often traumatic for women. The systematic destruction of resistant cities meant that many women were widowed, orphaned, or separated from their families. Those who survived were often enslaved or forcibly relocated to serve imperial needs in distant territories. The Mongols practiced strategic intermarriage as a tool of imperial integration. High-ranking Mongol men would marry noble women from conquered territories, both to cement political alliances and to produce children who could serve as intermediaries between different cultural groups. For the women involved, these marriages could represent either opportunity or tragedy, depending on the circumstances and the personalities involved. Some women married into the Mongol elite and gained significant power and influence. They became cultural ambassadors, helping to bridge the gap between Mongol and local customs. Their children often rose to prominent positions in the Mongol administration, serving as living symbols of imperial unity and cultural integration. But many others found themselves essentially prisoners in golden cages, cut off from their original communities, and never fully accepted into Mongol society. They were valuable as symbols and breeding stock, but they were also vulnerable to abandonment or abuse if their political utility diminished. Children faced their own unique challenges under Mongol rule. Traditional educational systems were disrupted or eliminated entirely. Children could no longer expect to follow in their parents' footsteps or inherit established social positions. The skills and knowledge that had been passed down through generations might suddenly become obsolete or irrelevant. Instead, they grew up in a world where merit and usefulness to the Mongol system determined their futures rather than family background or traditional social hierarchies. This could be liberating for children from lower social classes, who now had opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible under traditional systems. But it was often devastating for children from elite families, who found themselves stripped of inherited privileges and forced to compete on equal terms with children from much humbler backgrounds. The psychological adjustment to this new reality was often difficult and sometimes impossible. The Mongols had a systematic approach to dealing with the children of conquered elites. Boys who showed promise might be taken from their families and raised in the Mongol court, where they would be trained as administrators or military officers loyal to the Mongol system rather than to their original communities. This practice created a generation of cultural hybrids, people who were ethnically Chinese, Persian, Arab, or European, but who had been shaped by Mongol values and educated in Mongol institutions. They understood local customs and languages, but were loyal to Mongol authority rather than to traditional local elites. These individuals often became the backbone of Mongol administration in their home regions. They could serve as effective intermediaries between the Mongol ruling class and local populations, translating not just languages, but cultural expectations and administrative procedures. But they also lived with a fundamental identity crisis. They were neither fully Mongol nor fully members of their original cultures. They belonged everywhere and nowhere, useful to the empire but never fully trusted by anyone. Their loyalty was to an imperial system rather than to any particular community or cultural tradition. For ordinary families, the Mongol period meant constant uncertainty about the future of their children. Traditional apprenticeship systems were disrupted when master craftsmen were relocated or killed. Children might be recruited for military service, selected for relocation to distant territories, or chosen for specialized training far from home. Parents had little control over these processes. If Mongol officials decided that your child had useful skills or potential, your family preferences were irrelevant. The needs of the empire took precedence over individual desires or family bonds. This created enormous anxiety for parents who had grown up expecting to be able to guide their children's development and ensure their integration into stable community structures. The future became unpredictable in ways that made long-term planning impossible and created constant stress about circumstances beyond anyone's control. Children who grew up entirely under Mongol rule often adapted more easily than their parents to the new systems and expectations. They learned multiple languages as a matter of course, developed multicultural perspectives that helped them navigate the complexities of imperial society, and acquired skills that made them valuable to the imperial administration. But they also often felt disconnected from their ancestral traditions and cultural roots. They might know the stories and customs of their parents' generation, but these seemed like relics from a vanished world rather than living traditions that shaped their daily lives. The result was a generation gap that was more profound than anything that had existed under traditional systems. Parents and children might literally speak different languages, follow different customs, and pursue different life goals. Families were held together by affection and obligation, rather than by shared cultural identity and common expectations about the future. Chapter 10. The Economics of Empire. The Mongol Empire wasn't just a military achievement, it was an economic revolution that transformed how trade, taxation, and resource allocation worked across much of the known world. For ordinary people, this economic transformation was often more significant in the long run than the political changes that had brought it about. The most visible change was in trade and commerce. The Mongols created the first truly global trading system, connecting markets from Europe to Asia through a network of protected routes and standardized procedures that made long-distance commerce safer and more profitable than it had ever been before. This trade boom created new opportunities for merchants and entrepreneurs, but it also disrupted traditional local economies in ways that were often devastating for established producers and workers. Craftsmen who had previously served local markets now found themselves competing with products from across the empire. A potter in Persia might suddenly find his work competing with porcelain from China that was superior in quality and cheaper in price. A weaver in Central Asia might discover that silk from distant regions was undercutting his local market and making his traditional skills obsolete. A metal worker in Europe might find that weapons and tools from Damascus or Chinese workshops were driving him out of business. For some, this competition was devastating. Traditional crafts and industries that couldn't compete with imports simply disappeared, leaving entire communities without their traditional sources of income and forcing them to find new ways of making a living in an economy that was changing faster than they could adapt. But for others, the expanded markets created unprecedented opportunities for wealth creation. Skilled craftsmen whose work was competitive in the global market could now sell to customers thousands of miles away, reaching levels of prosperity that would have been impossible under traditional local trading systems. The Mongols actively encouraged this kind of economic specialization. They would identify the best producers of particular goods and relocate them to areas where they could be most productive. while ensuring that their products reached the widest possible markets through the imperial trading network. This created a kind of economic efficiency that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution, but it came at the cost of economic security for ordinary people. Under traditional systems, communities were largely self-sufficient. They produced most of what they needed locally and traded only for luxuries or specialized items they couldn't make themselves. Under the Mongol system, communities became specialized and interdependent. A region might focus entirely on producing one or two products for export while importing most of its other needs from distant areas. This made the system more efficient overall, but it also made individual communities much more vulnerable to disruptions in trade routes or changes in demand. If war broke out between different parts of the empire, if natural disasters damaged transportation routes, if political conflicts disrupted trade relationships, entire regions could suddenly find themselves without access to essential goods that they had become dependent on importing. The Mongol tax system was similarly revolutionary. Instead of the complex, overlapping, and often arbitrary taxation that characterized most traditional systems, the Mongols imposed a standardized system across their entire empire that was both more efficient and more oppressive than what had come before. Everyone knew exactly what taxes they owed and when they had to pay them. Tax collection was systematic and efficient, but it was also inflexible and often harsh. The Mongols were primarily interested in extracting resources to support their military and administrative apparatus. They had little interest in local development or investment unless it directly served imperial needs. This meant that while trade and commerce flourished at the imperial level, local communities often found themselves drained of resources that might have been used for local improvements or investment. The prosperity generated by long-distance trade was concentrated in imperial centers and among the merchant classes who served imperial interests, while ordinary producers and workers often found themselves working harder for less return. The Mongol currency system was another innovation that had profound effects on daily life. The Mongols issued paper money backed by imperial authority rather than by precious metals. This was centuries ahead of similar developments in Europe, but it required people to fundamentally change how they thought about money and value. Traditional systems were based on barter or on coins made from gold, silver, or other precious metals. The value of the money was tied directly to the value of the material it was made from. You could melt down a gold coin and still have gold worth almost as much as the coin had been. Mongol paper money had value only because the imperial government said it did. This required a level of trust in governmental authority that many people found difficult to accept. If the government collapsed or lost credibility, the money would become worthless pieces of paper. But for those who did accept it, the paper money system made trade much more efficient. You could carry large amounts of value in a compact, lightweight form. You didn't have to worry about the weight and security issues associated with precious metal coins. You could conduct business transactions much more quickly and easily. The Mongols also revolutionized credit and banking. They established a system of imperial banks that could transfer funds across vast distances without physically moving coins or precious metals. A merchant in Venice could deposit money and receive a letter of credit that could be redeemed for local currency in Beijing. This made long-distance trade much safer and more efficient. But it also meant that economic power was increasingly concentrated in institutions controlled by the Mongol government rather than in local communities or traditional merchant families. The empire was becoming not just a political entity, but an economic machine that drew resources from across the known world and concentrated them in the hands of imperial elites. Agricultural communities, which still made up the vast majority of the population, found themselves caught between the benefits and burdens of this new economic system. On one hand, the Mongols invested in agricultural infrastructure, improved irrigation systems, introduced new crops and farming techniques, and protected farmers from bandits and raiders. On the other hand, they imposed tribute requirements that often left farming communities with barely enough to survive after meeting their obligations to the empire. The security and technical improvements provided by imperial administration came at the cost of local autonomy and economic independence. The psychological impact of these economic changes was enormous. People who had grown up in communities where economic relationships were personal and local now found themselves part of an impersonal global system where their economic fate was determined by decisions made thousands of miles away by personal and local people they would never meet. Traditional concepts of fair price, just wage, and mutual obligation were replaced by market mechanisms that were efficient but often brutal in their effects on individual lives and communities. The security provided by traditional economic relationships was lost, but it was replaced by opportunities for advancement that had never existed before. Chapter 11: Cultural Transformation and Identity Crisis. Perhaps the most profound impact of the Mongol conquests was cultural rather than political or economic. The Mongols didn't just conquer territories, they created a new kind of cosmopolitan world that mixed traditions, languages, and ideas from across the known world in ways that had never been possible before. For people living through this transformation, it meant that everything they had taken for granted about culture, identity, and social organization was suddenly open to question. The basic assumptions that had shaped their understanding of how the world worked were no longer valid. Traditional cultural boundaries became blurred or irrelevant under Mongol rule. A Chinese engineer might find himself working alongside Persian mathematicians and European craftsmen on a project in Central Asia, using techniques and materials gathered from all corners of the empire. This created opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation that had never existed before. New technologies, ideas, and artistic styles spread across the empire with unprecedented speed. Scientific knowledge that had been isolated in particular regions was now shared and combined in ways that led to remarkable advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering. But it also created a sense of cultural displacement and uncertainty. People found themselves living in communities where multiple languages were spoken, multiple religions practiced, and multiple sets of customs followed simultaneously. The cultural coherence that had given meaning and structure to traditional communities was replaced by a cosmopolitan complexity that was both exciting and disorienting. For some, this cosmopolitan environment was liberating and inspiring. They discovered new ideas, new ways of living, new possibilities for personal development that their traditional cultures had never offered. They learned new languages, adopted new customs, and developed multicultural perspectives that made them more adaptable and more sophisticated than their ancestors. But for others, it was deeply disturbing and threatening. They felt that they were losing their cultural identity, that the traditions and values that had given meaning to their lives were being diluted or abandoned. They worried that their children would grow up as strangers to their ancestral heritage, unable to understand or appreciate the wisdom and beauty of traditional ways of life. The Mongols actively promoted certain kinds of cultural exchange while suppressing others. They were particularly interested in practical knowledge, military technology, engineering techniques, medical practices, and administrative methods that could be used to make their empire more efficient and more powerful. They would identify experts in these fields and relocate them to areas where their knowledge could be most useful. This created centers of learning and innovation that combined expertise from multiple civilizations in ways that would have been impossible under more isolated political systems. The Mongol court itself became a kind of international university where scholars, scientists, and technicians from across the empire could work together on projects that drew on the accumulated knowledge of humanity. The astronomical observatories built under Mongol patronage, for example, combined Chinese computational techniques with Islamic theoretical frameworks and Greek mathematical foundations. But the Mongols were less tolerant of cultural practices that they saw as threats to their authority or efficiency. Traditional legal systems, political institutions, and military organizations were systematically dismantled and replaced with Mongol alternatives that served imperial rather than local interests. This meant that while technical and artistic knowledge flourished under Mongol rule, political and legal traditions were often lost forever. The institutions and practices that had given structure to traditional societies were replaced by imperial systems that were more efficient but less responsive to local needs and values. Languages were another area where Mongol influence was profound and complex. The Mongols themselves had a relatively simple written language, but they adopted and adapted writing systems from the cultures they conquered. Mongol administrators learned to work in Chinese, Arabic, Persian, and Latin as needed. They employed scribes and translators who could work in multiple languages simultaneously, creating documents that could be understood by officials and subjects across the empire. This created a kind of multilingual administrative culture that made the empire more efficient, but also contributed to the erosion of local linguistic traditions. Children growing up under Mongol rule often learned multiple languages as a matter of course. This gave them advantages in terms of economic opportunities and social mobility, but it also meant that they might never develop deep fluency in their parents' native language. Over time, this linguistic mixing created new hybrid languages and dialects that reflected the multicultural reality of empire life. These languages were practical and useful, but they were also artificial in the sense that they had no deep cultural roots or traditional literary traditions. Art and architecture were similarly transformed under Mongol influence. The Mongols themselves had relatively simple artistic traditions based on nomadic lifestyle requirements, but they were enthusiastic patrons of artists and architects from the cultures they conquered. This led to the development of new artistic styles that combined elements from multiple traditions in unprecedented ways. Chinese painting techniques might be applied to Persian miniatures. Islamic architectural principles might be used in Buddhist temples. European decorative motifs might appear in Central Asian textiles. The result was an explosion of artistic innovation that created some of the most beautiful and sophisticated art in human history. But it also meant that traditional artistic styles were often abandoned or modified beyond recognition. Traditional forms of cultural expression that were tied to local identities and specific communities often disappeared or became marginalized. The epic poems, folk songs, and oral traditions that had preserved the history and values of local cultures were replaced by more cosmopolitan forms of literature and entertainment that served imperial rather than community purposes. Music underwent similar transformations. New forms of music emerged that combined instruments and styles from different traditions, creating sophisticated and beautiful compositions that reflected the multicultural reality of empire life. Court entertainments became elaborate spectacles that would have been unimaginable under traditional systems. But traditional forms of music that were tied to specific communities and occasions often disappeared as the social contexts that had sustained them were eliminated by imperial administration. Chapter 12: Life on the Margins, the Forgotten Millions. Not everyone lived at the center of Mongol power and prosperity. For many people, life under Mongol rule meant existing on the margins of a system that was primarily designed to serve imperial needs rather than local communities. These forgotten millions experienced the burdens of empire without enjoying many of its benefits. Rural areas that were far from major trade routes or administrative centers often found themselves largely ignored by Mongol authorities, except when it came time to collect taxes or recruit soldiers. These communities might go years without seeing a Mongol official, but they still had to provide tribute and accept Mongol authority over their lives. They experienced the costs of imperial rule without enjoying the benefits. Local leaders, who might have provided protection and assistance in times of crisis, had been eliminated or co-opted by the Mongol administration. Traditional community support systems were disrupted when young men were recruited for military service or skilled workers were relocated to serve imperial needs. The result was communities that were more vulnerable to natural disasters, economic disruptions, and social problems than they had been under traditional systems. When floods, droughts, or crop failures occurred, there was no local authority with the resources or motivation to provide assistance. But marginal communities also sometimes found ways to preserve traditional ways of life that were lost in more central areas. Remote villages might maintain traditional customs, languages, and social structures that were modified or abandoned elsewhere in the empire. This created a kind of cultural archipelago across the Mongol Empire, where islands of traditional life persisted within a sea of imperial transformation. These communities served as repositories of cultural knowledge and practices that might otherwise have been lost forever. Nomadic peoples who were not incorporated into the Mongol military structure also found themselves marginalized in complex ways. The Mongols respected other nomadic cultures, but also saw them as potential threats to imperial stability and unity. Some nomadic groups were forcibly settled and required to adopt agricultural lifestyles that were completely alien to their traditional culture and values. Others were incorporated into the Mongol military as auxiliary forces, but lost their independence and traditional leadership structures in the process. A few managed to maintain their traditional ways of life by accepting Mongol suzerainty and providing tribute, but even these groups found their freedom of movement and traditional territories restricted by imperial boundaries and administrative requirements. Ethnic and religious minorities faced particular challenges under Mongol rule. While the Mongols were generally tolerant of religious differences, they were less tolerant of political or cultural autonomy that might challenge imperial unity. Minority communities that had maintained distinct identities under traditional systems often found themselves under pressure to assimilate into the broader Mongol administrative culture. This pressure wasn't always explicitly coercive, but the practical advantages of cultural conformity meant that minority traditions were gradually eroded through a process of voluntary abandonment rather than forced suppression. The economic incentives for assimilation were powerful. People who adopted Mongol customs and demonstrated loyalty to the empire had access to better jobs, educational opportunities, and social advancement. Those who clung to traditional ways often found themselves excluded from the most profitable and prestigious positions. Women and children from marginal communities were particularly vulnerable. They had fewer resources and less protection than their counterparts in central areas, but they were still subject to Mongol policies regarding marriage, relocation, and military recruitment. Young women might be selected for marriage into the Mongol elite as part of alliance-building strategies, regardless of their personal preferences or family obligations. Children with useful skills might be recruited for training in imperial institutions, separating them permanently from their families and communities. Families in marginal areas had little recourse if they disagreed with these selections. They lacked the political connections, economic resources, or legal knowledge necessary to challenge imperial decisions. The choice was generally to comply with Mongol demands or face punishment as rebels. Disease was another factor that disproportionately affected marginal communities. The Mongol Empire's extensive trade networks facilitated the spread of diseases between regions that had previously been isolated from each other. Communities that had no previous exposure to certain diseases were devastated when traders, administrators, or military units brought new pathogens into their areas. The Black Death that spread along Mongol trade routes in the 14th century was perhaps the most dramatic example of this phenomenon, but smaller-scale disease outbreaks were a constant threat. Marginal communities often lacked access to medical knowledge or treatment that might have helped them cope with disease outbreaks. Traditional healers might have remedies for local ailments, but they were helpless against new diseases that had never been seen in their region before. Climate change and environmental degradation also affected marginal communities more severely than central areas. The Mongol Empire's intensive use of resources for military and administrative purposes sometimes led to overexploitation of forests, grasslands, and water sources. Communities that depended on these resources for their survival found themselves competing with imperial needs for access to increasingly scarce natural resources. Forests might be clear-cut to provide wood for imperial construction projects, leaving local communities without fuel or building materials. Grasslands might be overgrazed by imperial horse herds, reducing the carrying capacity for local livestock. Water sources might be diverted for imperial irrigation projects, leaving downstream communities without adequate water for their crops or animals. These environmental problems were often invisible to imperial administrators, who were focused on short-term resource extraction rather than long-term sustainability. But for the communities affected, they could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Chapter 13. Resistance and Rebellion, the Spirit That Wouldn't Die. Despite the overwhelming power of the Mongol Empire and the systematic nature of its control mechanisms, resistance never completely disappeared. People found ways to oppose Mongol rule, sometimes openly, but more often through subtle forms of non-compliance and cultural preservation that kept alternative visions alive even under the most oppressive circumstances. Open rebellion was rare and usually suicidal, but it did occur. The most successful revolts were typically led by members of traditional elite groups who had maintained some local support and could exploit Mongol weaknesses during periods of political transition or military distraction. These rebellions usually took advantage of periods when Mongol attention was focused elsewhere, when succession disputes weakened central authority, or when natural disasters or military defeats created opportunities for resistance movements to gain momentum. The Red Turban Rebellion in China, for example, began as a religious movement but evolved into a nationalist uprising that eventually led to the establishment of the Ming dynasty and the expulsion of Mongol rule from China. But even successful rebellions like this one required decades of preparation, enormous sacrifices, and favorable circumstances that rarely aligned. Most rebellions were quickly detected and crushed by Mongol forces that were specifically trained and equipped for counterinsurgency operations. The Mongol response to revolt was swift and brutal, designed not just to eliminate the immediate threat, but to discourage future resistance through the application of overwhelming force. Entire regions would be devastated to prevent the spread of resistance. Communities that had supported rebels, even passively, would be subject to collective punishment that could include mass executions, forced relocations, and the destruction of economic infrastructure. The message was clear. Rebellion might achieve temporary success, but the ultimate cost would be the destruction of everyone and everything the rebels were trying to protect. This created a psychological environment where resistance seemed not just futile, but actively harmful to the very people it was supposed to benefit. More common were forms of passive resistance that were difficult for Mongol authorities to detect or counter effectively. Communities might underreport their population or resources to reduce tax burdens. They might hide skilled workers to prevent them from being recruited for imperial service. They might sabotage imperial projects through subtle forms of non-cooperation that were hard to distinguish from incompetence or accident. Traditional cultural practices might be maintained in secret, passed down through families despite official discouragement. Children might be taught traditional languages, stories, and customs in addition to the imperial culture they learned in official settings. Marriage patterns, naming practices, and social relationships might be used to maintain traditional community structures despite official attempts to reorganize society along imperial lines. Religious resistance was particularly common and particularly dangerous. While the Mongols generally tolerated religious diversity, they were suspicious of religious movements that could serve as focal points for political opposition. Underground religious networks sometimes served as communication systems for coordinating resistance activities. Religious leaders who had been displaced by Mongol administrative changes sometimes became focal points for opposition to imperial rule. But religious resistance was also risky because it could easily be detected and punished. The Mongols had extensive intelligence networks and were skilled at identifying potential sources of opposition. Religious gatherings could be infiltrated, religious leaders could be monitored, and religious activities could be regulated in ways that made organized resistance extremely difficult. Economic resistance was another common strategy. Merchants might avoid trading with Mongol officials or might manipulate prices to disadvantage imperial interests. Craftsmen might deliberately reduce the quality of goods produced for imperial use while maintaining higher standards for local customers. Farmers might hide portions of their harvests or claim crop failures to reduce tribute obligations. Workers might engage in subtle forms of sabotage that reduced productivity without being obvious enough to warrant punishment. These forms of economic resistance were individually small, but collectively they could significantly impact imperial resources and efficiency. They also helped maintain a sense of agency and dignity among people who were otherwise powerless to influence their circumstances. Cultural resistance was perhaps the most important form of opposition because it preserved the possibility of eventual restoration of traditional ways of life. Languages, customs, stories, and traditions were maintained in private, even when they were discouraged or prohibited in public. Children were taught traditional values and identities, in addition to the imperial culture they learned in official settings. This created a kind of dual consciousness where people could function effectively within the imperial system while maintaining emotional and psychological connections to alternative traditions. Marriage patterns, social relationships, and cultural practices were used to preserve traditional community structures despite official attempts to reorganize society according to imperial priorities. This cultural resistance was particularly important for the long-term survival of non-Mongol identities within the empire. It ensured that when imperial control eventually weakened, there would still be alternative traditions and institutions available to replace Mongol systems. Intellectual resistance took the form of preserving and transmitting knowledge that contradicted official Mongol historical narratives or that supported alternative political philosophies. Scholars and scribes would secretly copy texts that had been banned or discouraged. They would maintain historical records that presented different perspectives on events than those promoted by Mongol authorities. Sometimes this intellectual resistance involved developing new forms of coded communication that allowed dissidents to share ideas without detection. Literary works might contain hidden meanings that were obvious to initiated readers but invisible to imperial censors. The effectiveness of resistance varied greatly depending on local conditions, the commitment of participants, and the sophistication of imperial countermeasures. In some areas, resistance networks were eventually discovered and crushed by Mongol authorities who had unlimited resources and no scruples about using extreme violence to maintain control. But in others, they persisted for generations, maintaining alternative traditions and identities that would eventually contribute to the empire's fragmentation and decline. The psychological impact of resistance was often more important than its practical effects. Even unsuccessful resistance efforts demonstrated that Mongol power was not absolute and that alternatives were still possible. This helped maintain hope and identity among conquered populations, even when immediate prospects for liberation seemed hopeless. Resistance movements served as reminders that the current situation was not permanent, and that change, while difficult and dangerous, remained possible. Chapter 14. The Price of Empire, when the system begins to crack. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had reached its greatest extent, stretching from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, encompassing perhaps a quarter of the world's inhabited land, and governing millions of people who had never chosen to be part of this vast imperial system. But this unprecedented achievement came with costs that were becoming increasingly apparent to both rulers and subjects. The constant warfare required to maintain and expand the empire was exhausting human and economic resources at an unsustainable rate. The Mongol military machine that had been so effective at conquest was less well suited to the long-term administration of settled territories. The nomadic culture that had given the Mongols their military advantages was increasingly incompatible with the requirements of governing agricultural societies and urban populations. For ordinary people, this meant that the period of rapid conquest and dramatic change was followed by a period of increasing instability and declining imperial efficiency. The benefits of Mongol rule, which had never been equally distributed, became even more concentrated among imperial elites, while the burdens fell increasingly heavily on common people. The Mongols had been successful conquerors, partly because they had adopted and adapted the best military technologies and administrative practices from the cultures they conquered. But this adaptability became a weakness as the empire grew larger and more complex. Different parts of the empire were administered according to different systems and traditions that reflected local conditions and available expertise. Communication between distant regions became increasingly difficult, despite the sophisticated postal system that had been one of the empire's greatest achievements. Local administrators developed their own priorities and interests that didn't always align with imperial objectives. Regional governors began acting more like independent rulers than imperial officials, building their own power bases and pursuing their own agendas. The result was a gradual fragmentation of imperial authority that created new uncertainties and challenges for ordinary people. They might find themselves caught between competing imperial factions, subject to contradictory demands from different officials, or abandoned entirely when imperial attention shifted to other priorities. Economic problems were particularly severe. The tribute system that had funded imperial expansion was becoming a drain on productivity rather than a source of strength. Too much wealth was being extracted from local communities and concentrated in imperial centers, where it was consumed by the court and military rather than invested in productive activities. Trade networks that had initially flourished under imperial protection were becoming strained by excessive taxation and regulatory burdens. The paper money system that had been innovative and efficient was losing credibility as people began to doubt the imperial government's ability to maintain its value. Local economies that had become specialized and dependent on imperial trade networks were vulnerable to disruptions caused by political conflicts, military campaigns, or administrative changes. Communities that had abandoned traditional self-sufficiency in favor of imperial integration found themselves unable to cope when that integration broke down. Social tensions were also increasing. The cosmopolitan culture that had emerged under Mongol rule was creating new forms of inequality and conflict that traditional societies had never experienced. People who had successfully adapted to the imperial system and gained wealth and status were increasingly resented by those who had been left behind or marginalized. The social mobility that had been one of the benefits of Mongol rule was creating new class divisions that were sometimes more rigid than traditional hierarchies. Traditional communities that had preserved their local identities and customs were coming into conflict with imperial administrators who demanded greater conformity and integration. The tolerance that had characterized early Mongol rule was giving way to more aggressive attempts to standardize and control local cultures. Generational conflicts were emerging as young people who had grown up under Mongol rule developed different values and expectations than their parents. Children who had been educated in imperial institutions often found themselves alienated from their ancestral traditions and communities. Environmental problems were another source of increasing difficulty. The intensive resource extraction required to support imperial activities was causing deforestation, soil exhaustion, and water pollution in many areas. Climate change was also affecting agricultural productivity and pastoral activities that form the economic foundation of many imperial territories. The Little Ice Age that began in the late 13th century made farming more difficult and reduced the carrying capacity of grasslands that supported nomadic populations. Disease outbreaks were becoming more frequent and severe as increased trade and movement facilitated the spread of pathogens between previously isolated populations. The Black Death that devastated much of the empire in the 14th century was the most dramatic example, but smaller-scale epidemics were a constant threat that undermined population growth and economic development. Political instability was perhaps the most serious problem facing the empire by the late 13th century. The succession system that had worked when the empire was smaller and more unified was breaking down as it grew larger and more complex. Different branches of the Mongol royal family were developing conflicting interests and ambitions. Regional administrators were asserting greater autonomy from central authority. The personal loyalty that had held the early empire together was being replaced by institutional relationships that were more fragile and less reliable. The result was a series of civil wars and succession disputes that weakened imperial power and created opportunities for local resistance movements. Instead of presenting a united front to potential enemies, the empire was increasingly divided against itself. For ordinary people, these political conflicts meant increased uncertainty and insecurity. They might find themselves caught between competing imperial factions, forced to choose sides in conflicts they didn't understand or care about, subject to changing policies and demands as different leaders gained or lost power. The protective benefits of imperial rule were diminishing, while the burdens of taxation and regulation remained high or even increased. Communities that had accepted Mongol rule because it provided security and prosperity found themselves wondering whether the costs still justified the benefits. Chapter 15: The Long Decline. When Empire Becomes Memory. The decline of the Mongol Empire was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process that unfolded over several generations, creating a world of increasing uncertainty, violence, and economic hardship for the millions of people who had spent their entire lives as imperial subjects. For people living through this decline, it was like watching the slow death of the only world they had ever known. The empire's fragmentation began with succession disputes among Mongol royal families, but it was accelerated by the practical impossibility of maintaining unified control over such vast and diverse territories. By the early 14th century, the empire had effectively split into several independent khanates that maintained nominal loyalty to the Great Khan, but operated as autonomous political entities pursuing their own interests and agendas. For ordinary people, this fragmentation meant that they might find themselves subject to different laws, taxes, and administrative systems depending on which local authority was currently in control of their area. Border regions were particularly affected, as they might change hands repeatedly as different khanates expanded or contracted their territories. Communities that had grown accustomed to the predictability and standardization of imperial rule now faced the uncertainty of constantly changing political allegiances and administrative systems. A merchant might find that a trade route that had been safe and profitable under unified imperial control was now subject to arbitrary tolls, conflicting regulations, and political violence. The breakdown of imperial unity also meant the breakdown of the trade and communication networks that had been one of the empire's greatest achievements. Roads that had been maintained and protected under unified imperial authority were now neglected or became battlegrounds between competing factions. The postal system that had enabled rapid communication across vast distances deteriorated as different regions stopped cooperating with each other and began treating imperial messengers as potential spies or enemies rather than neutral officials. Local conflicts that had once been quickly resolved by imperial intervention now festered and escalated into regional wars that could continue for years or decades. Communities that had relied on imperial authority to mediate disputes and maintain order found themselves forced to rely on their own resources and local alliances. Economic problems intensified as the empire's unified currency and credit systems broke down. Different regions began issuing their own money, making trade between areas complicated and uncertain. The paper money system that had been revolutionary when backed by unified imperial authority became worthless when people lost confidence in the government's ability to maintain its value. Many regions reverted to barter systems or local currencies based on precious metals, but this made economic activity less efficient and reduced overall prosperity. The specialization and interdependence that had characterized the imperial economy gave way to a return to local self-sufficiency that was less productive but more secure. Tax collection became irregular and often abusive as local authorities lost oversight from central administrators. Some areas were overtaxed while others were neglected entirely. The systematic approach to resource extraction that had characterized the unified empire was replaced by opportunistic exploitation that often devastated local economies. The rule of law that had been one of the benefits of imperial administration began to break down as different regions developed their own legal systems and enforcement mechanisms. The standardized justice that had been provided by the Yasa was replaced by a patchwork of local customs, arbitrary decisions, and personal vendettas. Military service, which had once been organized systematically across the empire, became a local responsibility that different communities handled in different ways. Some areas maintained traditional Mongol military organization, while others reverted to pre-conquest systems or developed new approaches entirely. This military fragmentation meant that conflicts that had once been quickly resolved through imperial intervention could now drag on for years or decades, devastating local populations and destroying economic infrastructure. Disease outbreaks became more severe and widespread as public health systems that had been maintained under unified imperial authority broke down. The Black Death that reached the empire in the 1330s spread more rapidly and caused more devastation than it might have under a more unified and effective government. Local communities that had relied on imperial resources and expertise to deal with natural disasters and disease outbreaks found themselves having to cope with these challenges using only their own limited resources and traditional knowledge. Cultural and religious conflicts that had been suppressed or managed under imperial rule began to resurface as central authority weakened. Different ethnic and religious groups that had been forced to coexist under Mongol rule began asserting their traditional identities and sometimes coming into conflict with each other. The cosmopolitan culture that had emerged under imperial rule began to fragment into more localized traditions that were sometimes hostile to each other. The tolerance and multiculturalism that had characterized imperial society gave way to more narrow and exclusive forms of identity. For people who had benefited from the imperial system's mobility and opportunities, this cultural fragmentation often meant a loss of status and prospects. The international careers that had been possible under unified imperial rule were no longer available, as different regions became more isolated and suspicious of outsiders. But for communities that had preserved their traditional cultures despite imperial pressure, the decline of central authority sometimes meant an opportunity to reassert their independence and autonomy. Traditional leaders who had been suppressed or marginalized under imperial rule could now emerge as alternatives to discredited imperial officials. Languages, customs, and institutions that had been preserved in secret during the imperial period could now be practiced openly as imperial control weakened. The cultural resistance that had been maintained through generations of imperial rule could finally bear fruit in the form of renewed traditional identities and autonomous communities. But this cultural revival was often accompanied by violence and social disruption as different groups competed for control of territories and resources that had previously been administered by imperial authorities. The peace that had been imposed by imperial power was replaced by conflicts that reflected ancient grievances and traditional rivalries. The end result was a world that was more fragmented, more violent, and in many ways more primitive than the imperial system that had preceded it. The benefits of imperial unity, trade, and administration were lost, but so were the burdens of imperial taxation, regulation, and cultural suppression. Chapter 16: Legacies and Lessons. What the Mongols left behind. As the Mongol Empire fragmented and declined, its impacts on the societies and cultures it had conquered became more clearly visible. These impacts would shape the development of much of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East for centuries to come, creating a world that was fundamentally different from what had existed before the Mongol conquests. The most obvious legacy was demographic. The Mongol conquests had caused massive population losses in many regions through warfare, disease, and displacement. Some areas took centuries to recover their pre-conquest population levels, while others never fully recovered and remained permanently changed in their demographic and cultural composition. But the demographic impact wasn't entirely negative. The Mongol Empire's encouragement of trade and urban development had also stimulated population growth in some areas. Cities that had served as imperial administrative or commercial centers often continued to prosper even after the empire's decline. The movement of populations across the empire had created new ethnic and cultural mixtures that persisted long after Mongol rule ended. Communities that had been relocated for imperial purposes often maintained their distinct identities while adapting to their new environments, creating cultural diversity that enriched the regions where they settled. Technological and scientific knowledge that had been spread across the empire through Mongol administrative practices continued to influence development in many regions. Innovations in agriculture, manufacturing, military technology, and administration that had been transmitted between different parts of the empire became permanent parts of local cultures. The printing technology that the Mongols had helped spread from China to other parts of their empire revolutionized communication and education in many societies. The movable type printing press, paper manufacturing techniques, and literacy practices that had been developed or transmitted under Mongol rule laid the foundation for intellectual and cultural developments that would continue for centuries. Medical knowledge that had been exchanged between Islamic, Chinese, and European traditions under Mongol rule continued to influence medical practice for generations. The hospital systems, surgical techniques, and pharmaceutical knowledge that had been compiled and transmitted through imperial scholarly networks provided the basis for continued medical advancement. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge that had been compiled and transmitted through imperial scholarly networks laid the foundation for later scientific developments. The observatories that had been built under Mongol patronage, the mathematical texts that had been translated and transmitted, and the scientific instruments that had been developed or improved under imperial sponsorship continued to influence scientific development long after the empire's decline. Trade networks and commercial practices that had been established under Mongol rule continued to influence economic development long after the empire's political collapse. The idea of long-distance trade, protected by political authority and conducted according to standardized procedures, had been demonstrated on a scale never before seen. Even after the Mongol Empire's fragmentation, merchants and political leaders continued to try to recreate similar systems of protected long-distance commerce. The concepts of standardized currency, credit systems, and commercial law that had been developed under Mongol rule influenced economic development in many successor societies. The Silk Road trade routes that had been revived and protected under Mongol rule continued to operate for centuries, connecting East and West in patterns of exchange that shaped global development. The commercial techniques, financial instruments, and trading practices that had been developed under imperial protection provided models for later commercial development. Legal and administrative practices that had been imposed across the empire also had lasting impacts. The Mongol emphasis on systematic record-keeping, standardized procedures, and merit-based appointment influenced governmental development in many regions. The concept of religious tolerance as a matter of state policy, while not always maintained by successor governments, had been demonstrated as a practical possibility. The legal principles embodied in the Yasa, particularly its emphasis on practical justice and equal treatment, regardless of social status, influenced legal development in many societies. The administrative techniques that had been used to govern such a vast and diverse empire provided models for later empire builders. The decimal organization system, the postal relay networks, and the intelligence-gathering methods that had been developed by the Mongols were studied and emulated by later governments. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol Empire had demonstrated that it was possible to create unified political and economic systems across vast and culturally diverse territories. This lesson would influence the ambitions and strategies of later empire builders from the Ottoman Empire to the British Empire. The Mongol example showed that successful empire building required not just military conquest, but also administrative efficiency, cultural tolerance, and economic integration. The techniques that had been developed for managing diversity, maintaining communications, and coordinating activities across vast distances provided blueprints for later imperial systems. But the Mongol Empire also demonstrated the ultimate limitations of pre-modern imperial systems. The empire's decline and fragmentation showed that even the most successful conquest states faced inherent challenges in maintaining unity across vast distances and diverse populations. The environmental and demographic costs of intensive imperial exploitation proved to be unsustainable in the long term. The reliance on military force and tribute extraction, rather than productive investment, ultimately weakened the empire's economic foundations. The cultural homogenization that had been pursued as a means of maintaining imperial unity proved to be both incomplete and counterproductive, generating resistance that eventually contributed to the empire's fragmentation. For ordinary people living in the post-Mongol world, these lessons were often learned through bitter experience. Communities that had prospered under imperial protection found themselves vulnerable when that protection was withdrawn. Regions that had become economically specialized and dependent on imperial trade networks struggled to become self-sufficient again when those networks collapsed. Populations that had been relocated and culturally transformed under imperial rule often found themselves caught between different identities and belonging fully to none. They were too changed to return to their original traditions, but not sufficiently integrated to be fully accepted by their new communities. But the Mongol period had also created new possibilities and expectations that persisted even after the empire's collapse. People who had experienced the benefits of long-distance trade, cultural exchange, and social mobility continued to seek these opportunities even under different political systems. Communities that had learned to adapt to changing circumstances and to work within large, complex administrative systems carried these skills forward into new situations. The adaptability and pragmatism that had been necessary for survival under Mongol rule became valuable assets in navigating the uncertainties of the post-imperial world. The cosmopolitan outlook and cultural tolerance that had been encouraged under Mongol rule continued to influence intellectual and artistic development in many regions. The idea that different cultures could learn from each other and that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness had been demonstrated on an unprecedented scale. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongol period had demonstrated that dramatic change was possible, that traditional systems and hierarchies were not permanent, and that individuals and communities could survive and even prosper under radically different circumstances. This lesson would prove valuable as the societies of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East continued to evolve and face new challenges in the centuries that followed. The memory of the Mongol Empire served as both a warning about the costs of imperial ambition and an inspiration for those who sought to create new forms of political, economic, and cultural organization. Chapter 17. The Human Cost: Counting the Uncountable. When we talk about the Mongol conquests, it's easy to get lost in the grand sweep of history, the strategic brilliance of the campaigns, the innovative administrative systems, and the cultural exchanges that reshaped the world. But behind all of these historical abstractions lay an enormous human cost that is impossible to quantify precisely but cannot be ignored. The demographic impact of the Mongol conquests was staggering. Modern historians estimate that the total population decline in conquered territories may have reached 10 to 15% of the world's total population at the time. This would make the Mongol conquests one of the most destructive events in human history, comparable in scale to the two world wars of the 20th century. But these statistics, as horrifying as they are, cannot capture the individual human experiences that lay behind them. Every number represented a person who had lived, loved, hoped, and suffered. Every destroyed city contained thousands of individual tragedies that were repeated across the known world. Consider what it meant for a family to live through the conquest of their city. Perhaps the father was a craftsman who had spent decades perfecting his skills, building a reputation in his community, and training apprentices to carry on his trade. In a single day, his workshop might be destroyed, his tools confiscated, his apprentices killed or enslaved, and his life's work reduced to ashes. The mother might have been a respected member of her community, known for her wisdom, her kindness, and her skill in managing a household. She might have been looking forward to seeing her children grow up, marry, and have children of their own. Instead, she might find herself watching helplessly as her family was torn apart, her children taken for imperial service, her husband executed as a potential threat. The children might have been excited about their futures, dreaming of following in their parents' footsteps, or perhaps achieving something even greater. Instead, they might find themselves orphaned, enslaved, or forced to adapt to a completely alien culture thousands of miles from everything they had ever known. These individual tragedies were repeated millions of times across the Mongol Empire. Every conquest involved the destruction of countless personal dreams, family relationships, and community bonds that had taken generations to build. But the human cost wasn't limited to those who died in the initial conquests. The survivors often faced years or decades of suffering as they struggled to adapt to the new imperial system. Children who grew up under Mongol rule never experienced the security and cultural continuity that their parents had known. Women who were forced into marriages with Mongol warriors or officials had to abandon everything they had been taught about family, culture, and identity. Men who were conscripted for military service might spend their entire adult lives fighting wars for an empire they had never chosen to serve. The psychological trauma of conquest and cultural displacement affected entire generations. Traditional sources of meaning and identity were destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The stories, customs, and beliefs that had given structure to people's lives were replaced by alien systems that served imperial rather than community needs. Many people lived with constant fear and uncertainty. They never knew when they might be selected for relocation, conscription, or execution. They couldn't plan for the future because they had no control over their circumstances. They couldn't trust their neighbors because anyone might be an imperial informant. The social bonds that had held communities together were systematically weakened or destroyed. Extended families were separated by forced relocations. Traditional leaders were eliminated or co-opted. Local institutions were dismantled and replaced with imperial alternatives. The result was a kind of social atomization that left individuals isolated and vulnerable in ways that traditional societies had never experienced. People had to learn to survive on their own rather than relying on the community support systems that had sustained their ancestors. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the human cost was how quickly it was forgotten or rationalized. The Mongol Empire's efficiency in propaganda and record-keeping meant that its version of events became the official history. The voices of the conquered were largely silenced or ignored. The benefits of imperial rule, such as increased trade and cultural exchange, were emphasized, while the costs were minimized or overlooked entirely. The empire's achievements in administration and military organization were celebrated, while the human suffering that made them possible was treated as an unfortunate but necessary cost of progress. This pattern of historical amnesia continues to this day. When we study the Mongol Empire, we often focus on its innovations and achievements while giving only passing attention to the millions of people whose lives were destroyed in the process of creating it. But the human cost was real, and it was enormous. The Mongol conquests represented one of the greatest human catastrophes in history, a tragedy that affected virtually every family and community across much of the known world. The survivors of this catastrophe showed remarkable resilience and adaptability, but they also paid a price that is impossible to calculate. They lost not just their lives and property, but their cultures, their identities, and their connections to the past. The world that emerged from the Mongol conquests was richer in some ways, more connected and more sophisticated, but it was also a world that had been built on the ruins of countless human dreams and aspirations. The price of empire was paid not by the emperors and generals whose names we remember, but by the ordinary people whose names have been forgotten. Chapter 18: Women's Voices in the Mongol Storm. While most historical accounts of the Mongol conquests focus on the military and political activities of male leaders, the experiences of women during this period were equally dramatic and often more complex. Women faced unique challenges and opportunities as the traditional world was torn apart and rebuilt according to Mongol priorities. For many women, the conquest meant immediate and devastating loss. Traditional protections and social roles were swept away overnight. Women who had lived secure lives as wives, mothers, and daughters of respected community members might suddenly find themselves widowed, orphaned, or enslaved. The systematic execution of male elites meant that many women lost not just their husbands and fathers, but their entire social support systems. Traditional marriage arrangements, inheritance rights, and family protection structures were destroyed, leaving women vulnerable in ways they had never experienced before. But the Mongol conquest also created new opportunities for some women, particularly those who were able to adapt quickly to the changed circumstances. Traditional Mongol culture gave women more authority and independence than was common in most settled societies, and some conquered women were able to take advantage of this cultural difference. Women who could serve as cultural intermediaries, translating between Mongol and local customs, often found themselves in positions of significant influence. They might become advisors to Mongol officials, administrators of local communities, or managers of important economic activities. The Mongol practice of strategic intermarriage created both opportunities and tragedies for women from conquered elites. Some women who married into the Mongol ruling class gained power and influence that would have been impossible under traditional systems. They became political players in their own right, able to influence imperial policy and protect their original communities. But many others found themselves trapped in marriages that were essentially forms of political imprisonment. They were valuable as symbols of conquest and integration, but they were also isolated from their original communities and often treated as exotic curiosities rather than full human beings. The children of these marriages faced their own unique challenges. They were living bridges between different cultures, but they were also permanent outsiders to both. They might inherit power and privilege from their Mongol fathers, but they could never fully escape the suspicion that they were potential traitors who might favor their mother's people over imperial interests. For ordinary women, the Mongol period meant adapting to new economic and social realities. Traditional women's work, such as textile production, food preparation, and household management, continued to be important, but it was now organized according to imperial rather than local priorities. Women who had specialized skills, such as weaving, metalworking, or medical knowledge, might find themselves relocated to areas where their expertise was needed by the imperial administration. This could mean separation from their families and communities, but it could also mean access to resources and opportunities that would have been impossible under traditional systems. The Mongol emphasis on practical skills over traditional social hierarchies meant that talented women could sometimes rise to positions of responsibility and authority regardless of their family background. Women who could organize production, manage logistics, or solve administrative problems were valued by imperial officials who cared more about results than about traditional gender roles. But these opportunities came at a cost. Women who succeeded in the imperial system often had to abandon traditional feminine roles and adopt more assertive, competitive behaviors that might be disapproved of by their original communities. They had to choose between traditional respectability and imperial advancement. Religious life offered another avenue for women's adaptation to Mongol rule. The empire's religious tolerance meant that women could maintain their traditional spiritual practices while also adapting to the cosmopolitan religious environment of imperial society. Some women became religious entrepreneurs, establishing new forms of spiritual practice that combined elements from different traditions. Others became scholars or teachers, preserving and transmitting religious knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the cultural disruptions of conquest. The breakdown of traditional family structures under Mongol rule created both challenges and opportunities for women's autonomy. While many women lost the protection and support of extended family networks, some also escaped from restrictive traditional roles that had limited their freedom and opportunities. Women who had been widowed or orphaned by the conquest might find themselves forced to become economically independent in ways that would have been unthinkable under traditional systems. This independence was often difficult and dangerous, but it could also be liberating for women who had the skills and courage to take advantage of it. The demographic disruptions caused by conquest and disease also changed women's roles in fundamental ways. In areas where male populations had been severely reduced by warfare or conscription, women often had to take on economic and social responsibilities that had traditionally been male prerogatives. Women might become heads of households, managers of businesses, or even informal community leaders in situations where traditional male authority figures were absent or ineffective. These roles were often temporary, lasting only until demographic balance was restored, but they provided precedents for women's capabilities that could influence future social development. The Mongol period also saw the emergence of new forms of women's resistance and agency. While open political opposition was usually impossible, women found subtle ways to preserve traditional cultures and identities while adapting to imperial requirements. Women were often the guardians of cultural memory, responsible for maintaining traditional stories, songs, and customs within their families and communities. They might teach their children traditional languages and values, while also preparing them to succeed in the imperial system. This cultural preservation work was crucial for the long-term survival of non-Mongol identities within the empire. When imperial control eventually weakened, it was often the cultural knowledge preserved by women that provided the foundation for renewed traditional societies. Chapter 19. Childhood in the Shadow of Empire. For children growing up during the Mongol conquests, the world was a place of constant change and uncertainty. Traditional childhood experiences, such as learning family trades, playing traditional games, and absorbing cultural values through daily life, were disrupted or eliminated entirely by the conquest and its aftermath. Children who lived through the initial conquests often experienced trauma that affected them for the rest of their lives. They might witness the destruction of their communities, the death of their parents, and the collapse of everything they had taken for granted about how the world worked. Some children were fortunate enough to be young enough to adapt quickly to new circumstances. These children might learn Mongol language and customs, develop skills that were valued by the imperial system, and eventually find successful places in the new order. But adaptation came at a psychological cost. Children who had been raised with traditional values and expectations had to abandon these in favor of imperial priorities. They might become successful imperial subjects, but they often lost connection to their ancestral traditions and identities. The Mongol practice of recruiting promising children for imperial service created both opportunities and tragedies. Children who were selected for this honor might receive excellent educations, access to imperial resources, and opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible under traditional systems. But they were also separated from their families and communities, often permanently. They were raised to be loyal to the empire, rather than to their birth communities, creating conflicts of loyalty that could last their entire lives. These recruited children often became the backbone of imperial administration in their home regions. They understood local conditions and customs, but they were trained to prioritize imperial interests over local needs. They were living symbols of the empire's ability to transform and co-opt potential opposition. For children who remained in their original communities, the Mongol period meant growing up with different expectations and opportunities than their parents had experienced. Traditional apprenticeship systems were disrupted when master craftsmen were killed or relocated. Traditional education systems were replaced with imperial alternatives that emphasized different skills and values. Children might learn multiple languages as a matter of course, developing multicultural perspectives that would have been impossible under traditional systems. They might acquire technical skills that were valued by the imperial administration, opening career paths that had never existed before. But they might also grow up feeling disconnected from their cultural roots. The stories, customs, and values that had shaped their parents' identities might seem irrelevant or even counterproductive in the new imperial environment. The breakdown of traditional family structures under Mongol rule created particular challenges for children. Extended families that had provided economic security and cultural continuity were often scattered by forced relocations or destroyed by warfare. Children might find themselves raised by strangers, adopted into Mongol families, or forced to survive on their own at ages when they would traditionally have been protected and nurtured by their communities. The demographic disruptions caused by conquest and disease meant that many children grew up without traditional generational connections. They might have no grandparents to teach them traditional knowledge, no uncles and aunts to provide alternative models of adult behavior, no extended family networks to support them during difficult times. This generational disconnection had profound effects on cultural transmission. Traditional knowledge and customs that had been passed down through families for centuries might be lost when the chains of transmission were broken by conquest and displacement. But children also showed remarkable resilience, and adaptability in the face of these challenges. They developed new forms of identity and belonging that combined elements from different traditions. They created hybrid cultures that reflected the multicultural reality of imperial society. Some children became cultural innovators, developing new forms of art, literature, and social organization that drew on multiple traditions while serving imperial needs. They were living bridges between different worlds, able to navigate complexity and change in ways that their parents' generation often could not. The Mongol emphasis on practical skills and merit-based advancement meant that talented children could sometimes rise to positions of authority and responsibility regardless of their family background. The empire needed capable administrators, skilled craftsmen, and reliable soldiers, and it was willing to recruit these from any available source. This created opportunities for social mobility that were unprecedented in traditional societies. A peasant's child might become an imperial official. A craftsman's daughter might become a merchant managing trade across continents. An orphaned street child might become a military officer commanding thousands of soldiers. But these opportunities came with costs. Children who advanced through the imperial system often had to abandon their original communities and identities. They became successful as individuals, but they lost connection to the cultural traditions that had shaped their early development. The result was a generation of people who were culturally sophisticated but also culturally rootless. They could function effectively in the cosmopolitan environment of the empire, but they often felt like strangers in their own birthplaces. Educational opportunities under Mongol rule were both more extensive and more limited than under traditional systems. The empire established schools and training programs that provided technical education and administrative training to promising students from across the conquered territories. These institutions produced graduates who were better prepared for careers in trade, administration, and military service than would have been possible under traditional educational systems. They created networks of educated professionals who could communicate across cultural and linguistic barriers. But imperial education also emphasized conformity and loyalty to the empire over critical thinking and cultural preservation. Students learned to serve imperial needs rather than to question imperial policies or to preserve alternative traditions. The long-term effects of childhood experiences during the Mongol period varied greatly depending on individual circumstances and choices. Some people who grew up under imperial rule became effective advocates for their original communities, using their imperial connections and knowledge to protect traditional cultures and interests. Others became completely assimilated into imperial culture, contributing to the empire's strength but losing connection to their ancestral traditions. Still others lived suspended between different worlds, never fully at home in any cultural environment. But all of them carried the psychological marks of growing up during a period of unprecedented change and uncertainty. They learned to be adaptable and pragmatic in ways that their ancestors had never needed to be. They developed skills for surviving and thriving in complex, multicultural environments. These skills would prove valuable as the empire eventually declined and fragmented, leaving them to navigate the challenges of a post-imperial world that was more diverse and changeable than the traditional societies their grandparents had known. Epilogue: the end of the world as they knew it. For the people who lived through the Mongol conquests, it truly felt like the end of the world. Everything they had known, everything they had taken for granted about how societies were organized and how life was supposed to work, had been swept away by a force that seemed to come from another realm entirely. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were reduced to rubble in a matter of days. Empires that had seemed eternal collapsed in a single campaign season. Ways of life that had been passed down through countless generations disappeared forever, as if they had never existed at all. Traditional hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as the mountains were overturned overnight. Kings became slaves, slaves became administrators, Warriors became farmers. Farmers became soldiers. Nothing was permanent. Nothing was certain. Nothing could be taken for granted anymore. The languages that people had spoken from birth might become useless overnight as new languages became necessary for survival. The gods that had protected their ancestors might be replaced by alien deities, or, perhaps worse, might seem to have simply abandoned their worshippers to face an incomprehensible fate. The skills that had taken lifetimes to develop might become obsolete in a single season as new technologies and new methods swept away traditional crafts and practices. The social networks that had provided security and identity might be scattered to the winds as families were separated and communities destroyed. And yet, somehow, life went on. It always does. People adapted. They learned new languages, adopted new customs, developed new skills. They found new ways to survive and even prosper under circumstances they could never have imagined. They created new forms of identity and belonging that combined elements from multiple traditions. Children grew up who had never known the old world, for whom the Mongol Empire was simply the natural order of things. The terror that had seemed so overwhelming during the conquest period gradually faded into memory, replaced by the ordinary challenges of daily life under any political system: earning a living, raising children, dealing with officials, coping with natural disasters and personal tragedies. The human capacity for adaptation proved to be stronger than any empire, more resilient than any political system, more enduring than any military force. People who had lost everything found ways to build new lives. Communities that had been destroyed found ways to recreate themselves in new forms. The Mongol conquests were perhaps the most dramatic example in human history of how quickly and completely the world can change when the right combination of forces comes together at the right moment. They remind us that no system, no matter how established or powerful it seems, is permanent. That change, when it comes, can be far more rapid and comprehensive than anyone expects. But they also remind us of the remarkable resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The human capacity to adapt, survive, and eventually thrive under the most challenging conditions is perhaps the most important lesson we can take from this remarkable period in history. The dust has settled now. The hoofbeats have faded into silence. The great Mongol Empire has been reduced to scattered ruins and faded memories in history books. The cities that were destroyed have been rebuilt. The peoples who were conquered have found new forms of independence. The cultures that were transformed have evolved into new forms that reflect both their ancient roots and their imperial experiences. But the echo of that thunder still reverberates through history, reminding us that the world we know is more fragile and more changeable than we like to believe. The institutions we take for granted, the cultures we assume are permanent, the political systems we think are stable, all of these can vanish more quickly than we can imagine. And that when change comes, as it inevitably will, our survival will depend not on the strength of our walls or the power of our armies, but on our ability to adapt, to learn, and to find new ways of being human under circumstances we cannot yet imagine. The Mongol conquests may have ended 700 years ago, but in a world that continues to change at an ever-increasing pace, their lessons have never been more relevant. Because in the end, we are all living through our own version of the storm from the steppe. We just don't always recognize it until the dust cloud appears on our own horizon. And by then, it's usually too late to do anything but hold on tight and hope we're strong enough to survive what comes next. The world is always ending. The world is always beginning. The question is not whether change will come, but whether we'll be ready for it when it does. The Mongols understood this better than most. That's why they conquered the world. That's why their empire, even in its decline and fall, changed the course of human history in ways that we're still discovering today. The question for us is, what do we understand? What are we prepared for? What storms are gathering on our own horizons? And will we have the wisdom and courage to weather them when they arrive? The people who lived through the Mongol conquests couldn't answer these questions for themselves. They had to live through the storm day by day, making choices without knowing what the consequences would be, adapting to circumstances they couldn't control, hoping that their children would find ways to build better lives in whatever world emerged from the chaos. They couldn't see the end of their story while they were living it. Neither can we. But we can learn from their experiences, draw strength from their resilience, and perhaps find the wisdom to navigate our own uncertain future with something approaching their courage and adaptability. Because one thing is certain, the storm will come again. It always does. The only question is whether we'll be ready for it when it arrives. Whether we'll have the strength not just to survive, but to help build whatever world comes next. The Mongols taught the world that everything can change, everything. But they also showed us that people can change with it, can adapt to circumstances that seem impossible, can find ways to preserve what matters most even when everything else is swept away. That might be their greatest gift to history. Not the empire they built, but the example they set of human adaptability in the face of overwhelming change. An example that we ignore at our own peril, and that we desperately need to remember as we face the challenges of our own rapidly changing world. The hoofbeats have faded, but the lessons remain. The dust has settled, but the changes endure. The empire has fallen, but the story continues. And somewhere in the distance, there's always another dust cloud rising on the horizon. The question is, will we be ready for it when it arrives?